Welcome to the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives discussion and listening session on strategies for improving data collection, analysis, and use. So at this time, I would like to turn the listening session over to Marcia Good, Executive Director of the Task Force, who will begin the program today. Marcia.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and we're just happy to have you here today. My name is Marcia Good, and I am the Executive Director of the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives, also known as Operation Lady Justice. It is my absolute honor and privilege today to introduce Chairman Aaron Payment of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, Michigan, for a traditional opening prayer.
Anin buju diwaka jigandishnakas makwa magizi endorum bawating endonjaba anishnabe ojibwe odawa otawatami endao miigwich wabanung miigwich jawanung miigwich ngabanung miigwich koignung miigwich nokumasayak miigwich misho ayak miigwich ki miigwich nabish miigwich doroshabo gawin demindemenda miigwich ogichita miigwich ogimak miigwich anishnabe kwe. So I just my name is Aaron Payment. I'm chairperson of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe. I just did my morning prayer in Anishinaabe Mowin, and I gave thanks to each of the directions, to our Mother Earth, to our waters, to our first sustenance, which is our mother's milk, and also to recognize that we are all relatives and we have a responsibility to one another. And I gave thanks to our women. And just on a personal note, this issue is very important to me. My sister years ago attempted suicide over in a bad relationship, and then her ex attempted to murder her, and she was struggling through addiction. And today, she has her MSW and she's in her dissertation phase, and she's a strong, resilient Native woman. But we each have a sister. We each have an auntie or a relative, a female relative, or a relative that has been either murdered or missing or been victimized. And so we all have a responsibility. This is not a us or them, it's all of us. And so with that, I hope that we have a wonderful proceeding and that we pray for the protection of all of our people. Miigwech.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chairman Payman. We really appreciate your being here today. Are honored. You've done many amazing things, especially in this area of data and looking at some of these things, especially with HHS, and we are honored that you are here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Task Force member Liz Fowler. She is the Acting Director of the Indian Health Service at the Department of Health and Human Services. Liz will provide our opening remarks. Liz?
Good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored to join this listening session today to discuss the needed resources regarding data to stop the violence within our communities. I'd like to begin by thanking the administration, Interior Secretary Holland, and HHS Secretary Becerra for their leadership and continued efforts to address the crisis of missing and murdered Native Americans and Alaska Natives. As the IHS Acting Director, I serve on the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives and the HHS Interdepartmental Council for Native American Affairs. I'd like to give a special thanks to the federal employees and stakeholders who have continued to serve on this task force as we work to make MMIT a priority. At the IHS, we are committed to working in partnership to address the underlying public health issues that contribute to high rates of violence and trauma: intimate partner violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child maltreatment, substance abuse, and historical trauma. Violence against Indigenous people has reached unprecedented levels, and our communities have been deeply affected for far too long. Despite this ongoing crisis, there are still many challenges and barriers we must overcome in order to adequately respond to the disproportionately high number of missing or murdered Indigenous people, including the use of inadequate record-keeping systems, racial misclassification, and poor coordination between law enforcement and tribal communities, just to name a few. The lack of quality data severely impedes the ability of communities, tribes, and policymakers to make informed decisions on how best to address this violence. And that is why we are here today. Challenges in tribal communities are best met by solutions that are informed and shaped by tribal and community leaders. For too long, a lack of coordination and transparency has hindered our ability to stop the violence committed against American Indians and Alaska Natives. Now is the time to act. The administration has made a priority of helping to solve the issues surrounding Indigenous people who go missing and those who are murdered across the United States. Missing and murdered Indigenous persons and their families deserve the attention of leaders at all levels of government. Our commitment to addressing these issues and to strengthening critical partnerships with our state, federal, and tribal partners is resolute. Together, I know we can end this crisis. Thank you, and that concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much, Liz. We are honored to have you on the task force. HHS and IHS in particular brings a very unique perspective to these issues that is separate and apart from a law enforcement response, a public health response, which is incredibly important. So thank you for your service on the task force and for your remarks here today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the task force in terms of what we did. So last year, during the first year of the task force, we held over 25 listening sessions and consultations, and we heard from tribal leaders and families and grassroots organizations and community members all across Indian nations. Today's session, along with several that we've already had, is more specifically targeted. And this one is targeted to discussing strategies for improving data collection, analysis, and regarding missing and murdered Indigenous persons. So today's session is being recorded, and a video, audio, and a transcript is going to be available on the Operation Lady Justice website in several weeks. So if we can move to our next slide, I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of the background of Operation Lady Justice. So the task force was started in November 26th of 2019 under Executive Order 13898. And it was basically aimed to enhance the operation of the criminal justice system and address legitimate concerns of American Indian and Alaska Native communities regarding missing and murdered people, particularly missing and murdered women and girls. Next slide, please. The task force has a specific focus, which is a public safety, public health partnership. I think we learned fairly early on and discussed the fact that we are never going to law enforcement our way out of these issues. Law enforcement is and a better law enforcement response is an incredibly important part, but unless we also work together with our public health partners at HHS, we're never going to get to the root of the crisis and never get to solving the actual problems that exist and being able to do both intervention and prevention. So this is an intersection of those two areas. We're trying to view missing or murdered through a holistic lens, not just a law enforcement lens, and working on analyzing data that comes in from a number of sources, not just law enforcement sources, but also public health sources, which are collected in a different way and analyzed in a different way. To show you a little bit more about the public health, public safety partnership that the task force has undertaken, there is a link here to 2 volumes of the DOJ Journal of Law and Federal Policy that were ultimately put together by Leslie Hagan, who is the head of DOJ's National Indian Country Training Initiative. She wrangled a number of us together to be able to write articles on all sorts of topics within missing or murdered. And there are topics that are dealt with by federal authors, by state authors, by tribal authors, by organizations, public health, law enforcement, all of those kinds of things. They are available on our website, and the links are also here. We will make sure that you have available the information if you would like to be able to read those, because it does show you kind of the connected way in which DOJ, DOI, and HHS has been viewing their work on the task force. Next slide. just briefly, the executive order set forth specific tasks. It is a federal working task force, and that is why there are no tribal leaders on it. Basically, the way the task force was set up is not a federal advisory committee like, say, the Non-Invisible Commission or the Indian Law and Order Commission. It is a federal working group with specific tasks that were set forth for us to be able to accomplish. The way that tribal community perspective and understanding is taken into account is through our tribal consultations and our listening sessions, of which we've done in excess of 30 now between last year and this year on a whole host of different topics. And so we want to make certain that we're hearing directly from the tribes about the things that we're doing and about ways that we can do those things better to assist tribes in these areas. So it's tribal consultation and listening sessions, listening and meeting is the very first and most important thing in the executive order. We were also tasked with developing model protocols and procedures to be able to improve the law enforcement response. We were tasked with collecting and sharing data, which is kind of one of the points of this listening session today, and also talking about better use of Namus and NCIC, which are databases that you're going to hear more about today. We are also tasked with putting together an unresolved cases review team that is being headed by Lori McPherson of the U.S. Marshal Service, who is on here today, and she has this section up and running. We're also tasked with bringing greater clarity regarding the roles and the jurisdiction in these cases in terms of best practices and facilitating formal intergovernmental agreements. We've often heard, and we all know, that many of the problems that occur in these areas is from the different jurisdictional mazes and trying to get jurisdictions to work together on these issues. We were also tasked with working on some education and outreach opportunities, which is being headed by Michelle Sauvé, a task force member from HHS, as well as Chuck Hurich from NIJ, and a couple of our MMIP coordinators, Dave Rogers being one of them. And then finally, we're also tasked with putting together reports that inform the administration about what it is that we've done towards all of these various tasks. The first year report was submitted in early December of last year, and we'll have another report that is due at the end of November of this year when the task force is due to sunset. If you want to take a look at that first year report, it is available on our Operation Lady Justice website. Next slide. Here is just kind of our organizational chart that gives you an idea of who is active within this task force in terms of the task force members. Co-chairs are the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Interior. The first year we had about 6 or 7 task force members, and then one of the recommendations was to add some additional task force members on to make sure that we were covering all kinds of agencies that we felt were not in the first year. So we have, DOJ FBI presence, DOJ OVW presence, DOJ Native American Issues Subcommittee presence, Andrew Burge, who is the U.S. Attorney from the Western District of Michigan, serving in that capacity. Brian Newland, who's our Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior. Jason O'Neill, the head of BIA OJS. Michelle Sauvé, Acting Commissioner for HHS-ANA. And then some of our newer task force members, Rob Chapman, who is the Acting Director of DOJ COPS Office. Kristen Mahoney, Acting Director of DOJ's Bureau of Justice Assistance, one of the particular funding arms within DOJ. Catherine Dark-Schmidt, who is the Deputy Director and in charge of the Tribal Division at DOJ's Office for Victims of Crime. So incredibly important to have them represented as task force members. And then Liz Fowler, who's the Acting Director of IHS, is a new task force member, and very glad to have her on. And then our final 2 members are Heidi Frechette, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for HUD's Office of Native American Programming, because we've all discussed many times with folks during listening sessions kind of the housing crisis that occurs in many Indian communities. And then finally, to make sure that we're looping in our tribal law enforcement partners for training, Thomas Walters, who is the director for DHS's Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, or FLETC, is also a task force member. So assisting the task force, I serve as the executive director, and I have 3 special advisors who just do a huge amount of work towards all the goals within our executive order. Matt Lysenkowski, who is the special advisor to the executive director and from the COPS office. Matt has worked on the task force in this role during the entirety of the task force. And beginning in 2021, we have 2 additional special advisors, Lori McPherson, who is from the U.S. Marshal Service, and Nicolette Rose, who is from DOJ's FBI. She is an intelligence analyst and is helping us, obviously, with data issues. So thanks so much to the 3 special advisors for the work that they've been doing to help this task force move forward on their projects. Next slide. We, from the beginning, kind of organized our task force into specific working groups that are listed here to just kind of break up the work that goes along the executive order to make sure that we were covering all of the different things that we were required to do within that executive order. And so each of the working groups has a chair or a set of co-chairs, meet regularly and work on the projects that are involved within their area. We have approximately 165 federal folks from DOJ, DOI, and HHS who are actually working on the task force on all of these different tasks that are within these working groups. Next slide. Okay, so that gives you a quick overview of Operation Lady Justice, and I want to turn it over now to our group of experts who are going to discuss the different data sources that collect information on missing persons and homicides. They'll provide some definitions of commonly used terms and talk about data interoperability and gaps. Our first speaker is Lori McPherson of the United States Marshal Service. Lori.
Good morning. Thanks, Marcia, and good morning, everybody. My name is Lori McPherson. I'm a senior policy advisor, and I sit over at the United States Marshal Service in their sex offender investigations branch. And what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of minutes is giving a top-level overview of the major data sources that we've been working with within the task force, within the data working group, just to familiarize everybody with some of the terms that the next few folks who present are going to be using. We're limiting this overview to federal sources. This is not the full universe of data sources that are out there, and I want to be really clear about that. There are state data sets, there are privately held data sets, there's other data out there, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to limit it just to those federal sources because we would get inundated if we tried to go over all of them. And the caveat on this is that this is really a top-level overview. So the folks who are coming after me may give some clarifications or may give a little bit more information about the particular data sets that may give a little more detail than what I'm able to provide. But this is just to give everybody the 101 on what we're going to be talking about. And these are in no particular order. So next slide. The first 2 are Namus and NCIC. Namus is the acronym for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. It is operated through the Department of Justice, NIJ, with a cooperative agreement. So this is a public-facing website that I assume a lot of you are familiar with. And it is a place where there's information about missing individuals and unidentified individuals. Basically, anyone could submit information to Namus, law enforcement, medical examiners, coroners, family members, the public. There is some vetting that goes on the backside to make sure that information is accurate, but it is open to the public. One of the things to remember about Namus, though, is that there's no federal mandate for any law enforcement agency, any medical examiner, any coroner to submit information. There are some state-level laws that require it, but it's not nationwide. So that's Namus. NCIC is kind of what folks generally think is generally what they're talking about when they're talking about the FBI databases. NCIC has a number of different subfolders, including the National Sex Offender Registry, other folders like that. One of the subfolders is the Missing Person File. And this is an FBI law enforcement-only database that is open to submissions from law enforcement, from NCMEC, from medical examiners, from coroners, but there are limitations to that data. The federal mandate for submitting information to NCIC, to the missing person file, is limited to folks who are under 18, to missing persons who are under 18. There are some asterisks for requiring submission for missing persons who are in danger between 18 and 21, but there's no federal mandate to submit data to NCIC for any missing adults. So again, there are going to be some gaps in this data, but the NCIC missing persons file is going to have some pretty good information when it comes to missing kids. All right, next. The next two are also FBI resources and are restricted to law enforcement as far as submission. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, is a program that's run through the FBI, through NCADC, through the National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime. It's law enforcement only. Again, this is a more operational kind of data set that folks use when they're actively investigating cases. Submission to VICAP is not mandatory across the country. It's something that is used periodically, sporadically by law enforcement, depending on the kind of case that they're working. Those data sets apply primarily to missing persons. VICAP also will involve homicides. When we get into these next data sets is when we're going to start looking at homicide cases, murder cases. The data set that folks are most familiar with when it comes to the FBI and homicides is the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, or UCR, through their supplemental homicide reports. Those reports gather information through the NIBRS system, through the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and it's collected by the FBI and then is analyzed and reported out in reports every year. And we've got Russ Myers from the FBI, who I believe is going to talk a little bit more about that. This is law enforcement only data that comes in, so the general public cannot submit information, and the submission is voluntary. And that's with an asterisk, but the submission is voluntary, and so UCR data will, just like the other data sets we've seen, there will be limitations and there will be restrictions on exactly how full the data set is when it comes to reporting that comes through in any particular year. Next slide. The last two, and I'll be deferring to our colleagues from CDC to explain these in more detail if it's going to be helpful for their presentation. But these are two systems that are run through the Centers for Disease Control. The first one is the National Violent Death Reporting System, and this is homicide data that's collected from the states, from medical examiners and coroners. So this is not, neither of these are law enforcement systems. These are public health systems that collects information. NVDRS it's a really very, very good collection of data. And the limitation on it is that it's homicide data only from 34 states at this point. So those states that are participating are submitting very good data to CDC. However, not every state is participating. So that's one of the top level limitations on it. And the last data set I believe that I have in this presentation is the National Vital Statistics Survey, NVSS, also conducted and analyzed by CDC. Also homicide data, also from medical examiners and coroners, and that submission and that participation is mandatory to the best of my understanding. And all of these are with asterisks, because these are a lot of these are very complicated in the way that they're actually administered. So I open myself up to technical corrections from our subsequent presenters. But those are the top level systems that we're going to be discussing. The presenters that are coming up may get into more detail about these particular systems, and I encourage them to do that. So next slide, I believe that is it. Oops. See, this is what happens. Two more data sets, and these are mentioned not as federal resources, but just to know that these other data sets are out there. So I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about them. First is the state missing persons clearinghouses, which are state offices, generally law enforcement submitted. Each individual state is going to operate a little bit differently on that. It's another data set that might be helpful. And then NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, has a little bit of a duplicative data set. Folks tend to take a look at NCMEC's information because what they put on their website is publicly available and can be helpful. But in practice, behind the scenes, anything that you're seeing on that public-facing website has already been, at a minimum, entered into NCIC to the missing persons file. So just keep that in mind if you're using that data. Next slide. All right, that's it for me, and I'll hand it either back over to Marcia or Russ.
Thanks, Lori. Yes, our next presenter is on data sources is going to be Russ Myers from FBI CJIS, and Dreama Fausch, also of FBI's Criminal Justice Information Systems, or CJIS. And they're going to be talking to you about the NCIC missing persons file and also about UCR. Russ?
All right. Thank you, Marcia. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Next slide, please. As Marcia stated, I'm Russ Myers, and I'm an analyst with the NCIC Program Office at the FBI CJIS Division. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the NCIC system and then go more in depth into the missing person file. Next slide. So first off, what is NCIC? Well, NCIC is the National Crime Information Center, and we consider it an electronic filing cabinet full of criminal justice information made available to federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement agencies nationwide. It's a voluntary system with the exception of missing persons under the age of 21, so we encourage states and agencies to send us their data, but it is totally at their discretion. Next slide. So why NCIC? Why would states voluntarily choose to send the FBI their records? Three main reasons: to protect the public, to protect law enforcement personnel nationwide, and to assist in apprehending fugitives, tracking terrorists, locating missing persons, and locating and returning stolen property. Next slide. So here's a breakdown of the current NCIC files. We have 14 person files and 7 property files. Wanted person is our largest person file, and gun is the largest property file. Each file has a minimum criteria for entry that was determined by the Advisory Policy Board, and all policies are vetted through the working groups and the NCIC subcommittee. The state CJIS systems agencies can have stricter requirements if they wish to enter into NCIC, but at a minimum, they must meet the minimum NCIC criteria for entry. NCIC currently has over 16 million active records and normally averages 10 to 11 million transactions a day with a response time of less than 2/100ths of a second. That transaction average has dropped down a little bit due to the pandemic to around 7 million transactions a day. Next slide. So the missing person file is one of the oldest NCIC files, started in 1975. To be entered, an individual must meet one of the following 6 criteria, most of which are self-explanatory. For disability, this is someone who has a physical or mental disability and subjecting themselves or others to personal and immediate danger. For endangered, this is a person missing under circumstances indicating his or her physical safety may be in danger. For involuntary, this would be a person missing under circumstances indicating the disappearance may not have been voluntary, such as a kidnapping or an abduction. For juvenile, this is a person who is missing and not declared emancipated by the laws of his or her state of residence and does not meet the criteria for disability, endangered, involuntary, or catastrophe victim. Catastrophe victim, that one's pretty easy. That's a person missing after a catastrophe. And for other, this individual doesn't meet any of the above criteria and there is reasonable concern for his or her safety, or the person is under the age of 21 and declared emancipated by the laws of his state. The entering agency must also have a report on file to support the missing person entry as well. Next slide. So while the missing person file has over 50 fields to input descriptive data into, here are the mandatory fields required for a missing person entry. We at least need your name, sex and the race, the height and weight, the date of birth and date of emancipation if it's a juvenile, the eye and hair color, the missing person code, the date of last contact with that individual, and the agency case number. If the individual is being entered into a category other than juvenile, there must be at least one numerical identifier, such as a date of birth, an FBI number, social security number, license plate information. Next slide. So here's some federal legislation that has made some significant changes to the missing person file over the years. We had Suzanne's Law in 2003. This law requires agencies to immediately enter records for missing individuals under the age of 21. This was previously only under the age of 18. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006 implemented the 2-hour mandatory missing person entry into NCIC, changing it from 24 hours. And Savannah's Act, which was passed towards the end of last year, there are many purposes of this act, among them being improvements to the collection of missing and murdered Native American data and the reporting of that information. Next slide. Regarding missing person statistics, one statistic that creates a lot of confusion is the entry total versus the active NCIC missing person file record count. In calendar year 2020, there were 9,575 missing Native American entries made into the NCIC. That number does not represent 9,575 individuals that went missing. This number could include those individuals that ran away multiple times throughout the year and were entered into the NCIC by the reporting law enforcement agency. So if an individual runs away 10 times, they can be entered into NCIC 10 separate times. So that's going to be 10 entries for that one individual. The active record count at the end of 2020 is the number of active records in the system at that point in time. And the records could be from any point in time, not just 2020. NCIC missing person records stay in the system until the entering agency takes action on that record. So the 1,496 active records at the end of 2020 should not be directly compared to that 9,575 entry total. I admit it does get confusing, but this is the way the numbers are. As of July 26th, yesterday, there were 243 of those entries that were still active in the NCIC. So just to clarify, of the 9,575 entries made in 2020, 243 of those remain active in the system today. I'll discuss more on the 2020 statistics during the next portion of the presentation. Next slide. If you'd like more information on the NCIC, you can navigate to the Operation Lady Justice website and look under the Education and Resources tab, where you will find numerous fact sheets, including one on the NCIC, which summarizes a majority of what I have covered today. Next up, I'll hand this off to Dreama Fouch, who will discuss the FBI CJIS UCR program.
Thanks, Russ. I'm Dreama Fouch. I'm with the FBI UCR program. I'm an analyst, and I've been with the program well over 20 years. I'll give you a very high-level overview of our program, some of our data collections, and what it is we do once we collect the data. Next slide. So as you can see from the slide, the UCR program and the collection of crime data has been around for a very long time. Back in the late 1920s, the International Association of Chiefs of Police recognized a need for national crime data. So they went about organizing a way to capture that information to help law enforcement address the needs of the communities. In 1930, the United States Attorney General designated the FBI to maintain the nation's data, and we became the crime data repository. And at that time, we only collected data under the summary reporting system, and that was an aggregate count of the data month to month. Throughout the years, we have improved the crime data collection, and we eventually expanded and implemented the National incident-based reporting system in the late 1980s and actually rolled that out in early 1991. So you can see there was a large span of time when we only collected aggregate counts of crime data, but in 2015, we decided as the FBI UCR program that it was time to move away from summary reporting and implement NIBRS as our standard crime data collection. So in the past 5 years, we've gone about making that transition. We gave our states and local law enforcement agencies a timeline in which to meet our deadline of January 1, 2021. And we did make that transition this January. So we no longer accept data in the summary format. Folks must report through NIBRS. Currently, our landscape for law enforcement agencies is over 18,000, and those folks actually voluntarily give us their crime data. However, with our federal LEAs, they are required to report crime data to the FBI UCR program under the Uniform Federal Crime Reporting Act of 1988. And we are working with those federal law enforcement agencies to become compliant, and we're doing pretty good. We have over 40 now that are giving us data, and that includes the FBI. So what type of data is it that we collect in the UCR program? Well, we want our law enforcement agencies to give us data on offenses that are reported or known to them or on persons that they arrested. Next slide. So we have 4 primary data collections within the program. One of them is our law enforcement officers killed and assaulted data collection. And what we collect here is those officers that have been feloniously or accidentally killed, or those officers that were assaulted while performing their duties. We want to have that information on hand to know, how to better protect our law enforcement officers as they execute the duties of their position. So with the data, we can do research, we can provide instructional services related to law enforcement safety. We want to reduce these types of incidents and deaths. We make that data available in real time now. Historically, it was not released in real time, but it is now. And I touched briefly on our National Incident-Based Reporting System as our primary crime data collection point for the program now. And NIBRS collects data on each single crime occurrence, and it provides a more precise narrative about the scope, type, and nature of the crime that's being committed. It also provides greater context to help identify specific crime issues that may be occurring and will help our law enforcement agencies make better policing decisions and perhaps drive their resource planning. NIBRS also offers transparency that can improve law enforcement relationships with the communities that they serve. And I think that's key. We want our law enforcement agencies to have that transparency within their communities. I think it's important given where we are today. A new collection to the program is the National Use of Force Data Collection. This collects use of force incidents resulting in the death or serious bodily injury of a person, as well as all firearm discharges at or in the direction of a person. This gives law enforcement an opportunity to be proactively transparent. It also allows them to provide context of the narrative of those incidents. And of course, the FBI manages that data collection, and we are considered a trusted law enforcement partner. The other data collection is our police employee data. And annually, we collect information on all full-time law enforcement employees, both officers and civilians, and we break it down also by male and female. Next slide. So we gather all of this data. So what do we do with it? So we release it. I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with our Crime in the United States annual publication. It's been around as long as the program's been around, but we have started to push the data out more frequently. So now we have our preliminary uniform crime reports. Those are going out quarterly. So we started that a year or so ago. We want to be able to push the data out more quickly for folks, make it readily available for use. We also have publications of the LEOCA data. We do a Part 1 and a Part 2 report on the LEOCA data. Of course, we have our Crime in the United States. That's our annual publication, and that represents all of the data collected for the reporting year. We also do our hate crime statistics publication, and that is simply our hate crime data, which is now collected through NIBRS. We also do a NIBRS publication separate from Crime in the United States. The NIBRS pub is just that. It's NIBRS data, unconverted. It's simply what folks have given us through that reporting system. And we also publish National Use of Force data from the National Use of Force data collection. And right now, we have only released participation data for that data collection. But as more data and more participation increases, that publication will continue to grow. So again, this year, we made it a point to have all of our data releases exclusively on the Crime Data Explorer. We're migrating away from FBI.gov and making all of our data available at Crime Data Explorer. Next slide. So what is Crime Data Explorer, or as the FBI and most federal entities, we like our acronyms, we refer to it as CDE. We launched it in 2017, mid-year. It enables law enforcement and the general public to view, access, and understand the data that is collected. It provides dynamic views of the data. You can download, you can explore by different data types, whether it be location or crime type. It enables you to do tailored reports. You can go out and take a look at the NIBRS data. You can do bulk data sets if you would wish to download that type of data. And I've provided the link there for anybody that would want to go out and take a look at Crime Data Explorer. You can also, in your browser, just type in Crime Data Explorer and it'll take you to the page. Next slide. And I think that's it for me. I'll turn it back over to Marcia.
Thanks so much to Russ and to Dreama. We'll move on to our next presentation, which is Chuck Hurich of DOJ's National Institute of Justice to talk about Namus. Chuck?
Thank you, Marcia, and thanks everybody for attending this listening session. It's a great honor for me to be here to talk about Namus. As Lori mentioned earlier in the presentation, Namus is an acronym for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, a program that is run by the National Institute of Justice, currently through a cooperative agreement with the University of North Texas. And we have also recently, in April, entered into a contract with the Research Triangle Institute to manage the program moving forward, starting on October 1st. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That is the landing page for the Namus database, and that is where you can go in and search for missing, unidentified, or unclaimed persons cases. And one of the unique features about Namus is that it does have a public-facing portal where families and friends can enter cases into the system and work with our regional program specialists around the country to have these cases vetted and then published for visibility across the nation. Next slide, please. The real core or foundation of the Namus program is the Namus technology. The Namus 2.0 database is, as I said, a central repository for storing, sharing, and comparing all the missing, unidentified, and unclaimed persons case information. Now, as mentioned in an earlier part of the FBI's presentation, putting cases into Namus is optional. It is not a mandatory, it is not a legislatively mandatory database, and I'll speak to that in a couple more slides. But using the technology and the database, you can use it for case management, advanced searching capabilities, and automatic matching tools, all that are within the Namus application and can help expedite case associations and resolutions. As I mentioned earlier, Namus is searchable by anyone. However, to protect case-sensitive data, we do have professional users that are medical examiners, coroners, law enforcement officers, and allied forensic professionals that do enter case-sensitive information and can only view that information and is not viewable by the general public. The Namus technology, as I said, is the foundation of the program, but the program also offers free investigative support, like I said, to our 9 regional program specialists across the country. We do also offer free forensic services, DNA analysis, fingerprint analysis, forensic odontology or dental comparisons, and forensic anthropology. Through our contract with RTI moving forward, we hope to expand those capabilities and decrease the turnaround time with which forensic services are offered. Next slide, please. This is a quick view of how you can look at cases in the Namus database. We have a list view, which you can see on the left, just gives you a list of cases once you enter the search criteria that you were interested in. We also have a gallery view, and that shows you a picture that is associated with that case. The third and final view that you can see is a map view. So you can see where a cluster of cases may be across the country or where several different types of cases that may be associated are in the country. You can also look on the map for law enforcement agencies and the closest medical examiner and coroner office in your location. Next slide, please. I did say earlier that Namus is an optional system. It is not mandatory to put cases into Namus, but there are 10 states that have passed legislation that mandate the use of Namus for missing and unidentified persons cases. And on this map, you can see those states. We hope to have more states pass legislation like this. New York's in particular is a very strong legislation because they took the time to speak directly to Namus staff. And our executive director, BJ Spalmer, will be presenting later, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the data that we collect and the reports that we put out for the tribal community. Thank you for this time. I could go into way more depth about Namus, but we do offer trainings through our regional program specialists, and through the program, you just can reach out to them and contact us for more in-depth information on the Namus system. Now I'll turn it back over to Marcia.
Thanks, Chuck. Wonderful presentation. Namus is a system that many people are using, and certainly a lot of folks know about it. So glad that you're on to be able to talk a little more about that for us. Our next presenters, I'm going to be turning the screen over to Delight Satter of the Office of Tribal Affairs and Strategic Alliances in the Center for State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention within the Department of Health and Human Services, and Laura Collar of the Division of Violence Prevention, DVP, in the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, also in CDC. And they have some amazing public health information to share with you. So Delight and Laura.
Well, thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Delight Satter. I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Round, and I serve on the OLJ panel as a worker bee and as a subcommittee co-chair for the data work group. So of course, this day is great for us to be able to share with you some of our information around public health and primary prevention of violence. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So in this slide, we share with you an example of some of the recent work that we have done at CDC in response to OLJ's need for data. So this fact sheet, they'll throw into the chat so you have the easy link. We highlight that homicide is the third leading cause of death for Native men and sixth for women. I want to be sure, like this morning with Erin's opening, that we remember that it is also our men and our young boys that are also at risk. It's all our relations. I really like the way Erin said that. So what is going on with homicides? In public health, we like to look at the circumstances around events when it comes to injury prevention. And you'll see the data there talks about nearly half of homicides for American Indian and Alaska Natives are precipitated by arguments and some of the other information. I won't read through the slide, but please do go grab that slide out of the link and include that in your, we hope that it's a useful resource for you. And if you could let us know if you have any other needs for short data sources, just let us know and we'd be happy to work on those for communities. So next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the public health model in prevention of violence. Bear with me, I'm switching screens here. So violence is preventable, that's the good news. We don't have that much time to go into the details of the injury prevention models today, but I do invite you to join us on August 4th. The CDC Tribal Advisory Committee has requested time on their agenda to discuss MMIP, so we'll go into it a little bit more deeply, and we'll put the registration link in the chat as well. Native people are at increased risk to be missing or murdered because they experience all the same factors that put any individual at risk for violence. It's compounded by centuries of structural inequities rooted in systemic violence against Native people. And Native communities are surviving, and through action, they are moving towards collective healing. And there is a focus on the promotion of health and well-being and ultimately to the prevention of MMIP. That's what we see from our primary prevention and public health role. Great activism, not just in data, but also in programming and prevention at community levels. So CDC uses a shared risk and protective factor approach to understanding root causes of violence. And let me make sure, go to the next slide, please. So this means that we focus on reducing factors that put people at risk and increasing factors that protect or buffer people from violence. This concept of public health, where we're focusing on the healthful way of living or that healing journey, generally aligns very well with tribal communities' indigenous views and frameworks for health and well-being. So we like that in public health, that there's this good match between our way of looking at things in many tribal communities. Okay, next slide. Now, here we're going to give you just a sampling of what we've been up to related specifically to MMIP and some of our work that's related to MMIP. And we've kind of focused on some areas that really kicked off as a result of the collaboration and partnership across all of government with Operation Lady Justice. But the first two are two data sources that you've heard mentioned a few times earlier. And let's just say that if you'd like more detail, you can contact us, and we're happy to go into the deep weeds with you on data because we love data. But for today's purposes, I'll just give a cursory overview. So the National Violent Death Reporting System, or NVDRS, that data source, which is housed at CDC, links information about who, when, where, and how a violent death occurred. and it provides insights about why homicides occurred. So of course, for many of you who know the public health model, that's the first step. We always try to define the problem, and we use data and community knowledge and anecdotal information to try to really understand what is going on. Because if you know what is going on, then you can determine, how to intervene and how to protect people or change behavior patterns or whatever at a community level. So the other data source, the second bullet, is the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey called NCIC. And that is an ongoing survey that collects the most current and comprehensive national and state level data on intimate partner violence, what we call IPV, sexual violence, and stalking victimization in the US. We do plan to have a native oversample, which is under consideration for future data collection years. Okay, now go back over here, make sure I'm on the same place as you all. Now we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the direct efforts that we've been engaged in through OLJ and generally on MMIP at CDC. You see that list there. So I'll give you a few examples of each of those. So we start off with sort of the direct efforts around technical assistance. So CDC actually loves to provide technical assistance. We're loaded with a bunch of scientists and public health advisors at CDC, and we love to partner with community. We have formal partnerships with funded awardees that support some of our work and their own efforts. And we also are available to provide presentations. We have provided technical assistance around data for tribal judges, tribes, the media, other federal partners. And, this is a free service to you. Just reach out to us at the links in the chat or contact us through the OLJ resources. We're happy to partner with communities that need data or need some subject matter expertise in analyzing their data. We have partnered with NIHB and NCUI in a number of ways, listening to communities about what needs are, getting information that help us think through public health approaches and prevention for future years in planning. We've been generously provided opportunities by NCUI and the American Public Health Association to present the public health primary prevention model and to get feedback from people. We had actually a very award-winning Changing Directions panel about a year and a half ago, focused on MMIP, and they'll drop the link in there. And people on the call today that are joining us were our guest stars, and we discussed ongoing and historical trauma and the connection to that and violence in Native communities and primary prevention. What are we going to do about it? That's really actually an excellent show. I like that one. And we've partnered with some of our Native communities leading traditional medicine people like Theta Newbreast to help us host convening sessions around Native violence in general so that we can learn more and do better. So those are some examples of direct things that we've been up to related to MMIP and growing our portfolio and strengthening our data efforts for communities. Then we have things that are going on indirectly. So, of course, the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, where my colleague Laura Kohler is working, they have ongoing efforts that are connected indirectly to violence and to MMIP, such as their work in the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs field. And the goal is to seek to understand and create safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments for children. So we believe those are connected to MMIP. So that work is ongoing. It's not directly connected to OLJ, but it's there and connected. And many of their other activities, including surveillance. They have a program called the Rape Prevention and Education Program that works on the prevention of sexual violence at the community level. And we're happy to go into detail on those during the Q&A period if people have specific questions about, where are those programs? How do they function? How do you get more information? Let's go to the next slide. So I really wanted to share with you, this is pretty much our last slide, but I wanted to share with you all some of the actual products that have been developed as a part of OLJ. Really catalyzed by listening to communities at the listening sessions hosted by DOJ and other places. So the fact sheet, of course, user-friendly. The STAR collection, which is a growing series of books that are all around health promotion and violence prevention for youth and children. And we have two out now, more are scheduled. They're similar to the Eagle books from the diabetes collection you might be aware of from CDC. The third bullet there with all the names, that's all the native advocates and public health practitioners that we joined with to create the very first public health primer on MMIP. That's at the DOJ link that was shared earlier. And in short order, just within the next few months, our paper on homicides. So we analyzed almost 2 decades of data on homicides using the NVDRS data source mentioned earlier. There will be a paper published in MMWR. This paper is led by our dear colleague, Dr. Emiko Petrowski, and a team within CDC. My very last point before we close is to thank traditional healer Miguel Flores and Professor Michelle Kahn-John, who created this beautiful logo for our work within the paper on the public health prevention of MMIP. Thank you very much, Marcia. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to the Q&A portion later. This is a toolkit. I think they're letting you see the toolkit. This is a toolkit with many packages. They're not adapted for Native communities, but they're a good start. If you're a community wanting to design programming in any of those areas, you can click on those links and get there. And of course, contact Laura, me, and the team at CDC to help with adaptation if you're interested in those programs.
Thank you so much, Delight. Really appreciate all of that great information. As my background is more in the law enforcement criminal justice area, starting to work with HHS and especially with folks, at CDC and ACF and ANA, it's just been an amazing partnership, learning, the different ways in which we do things and where we need to come together. And so working with, especially Delight and Laura, Michelle Sauvé and Travis Roberts on this task force has just really been amazing. So we really appreciate your work. Thanks so much. Okay, our next presenter is going to be Tina Crossland from the National Institute of Justice. And she's going to present for you on some research and evaluation on missing and murdered Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Marcia. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you, and I hope you and yours are safe and well. As Marcia mentioned, I'm Christine Crossland. Many of you know me as Tina. I'm a federal scientist, specifically a social and behavioral researcher who's been at the National Institute of Justice for 23 years. Presently, I'm directing NIJ's Violence Against Women and Family Violence Research and Evaluation Program, and a program that focuses on the safety of American Indian and Alaska Native women living in tribal communities across the United States. NIJ has a sister agency, which you may know as the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, whereas BJS is the primary statistical agency of the department. NIJ is referred to as the Research, Development, and Evaluation arm of the Department of Justice. We've been described as a knowledge broker, whereas we facilitate multi-way exchange of information about the criminal justice system and everything impacting it. We're established well over 50 years ago and have had a significant federal role in assisting state, tribal, and local officials. And it's ultimately our job to bridge the gap that can exist among different worlds and build connections and solutions. And NIJ achieves this mission through our listen, learn, and inform model. We listen to the needs of the field. We learn ways to meet those needs by funding research and develop and evaluate projects, and then inform the field of what we've learned. Next slide, please. I am honored to be part of today's discussion and the opportunity to provide information on an important topic of federal agency response to missing Indigenous people and to help bring awareness to important resources available to communities and organizations. These issues are very important and something my organization has been grappling with for some time now, especially regarding identifying barriers to reporting and investigating violence experienced by Indigenous peoples, and specifically about missing person cases in which we can find viable and effective solutions. One of the barriers is data systems. We have already heard from my colleague, Chuck Kurek, about the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Chuck represents the investigative and forensic side of NIJ's house. I'm representing the social and behavioral side of NIJ, and I'm going to provide some additional information on some studies we're currently working on or anticipate implementing in the coming months. Next slide, please. First, there are some publications that tribal leaders and stakeholders may find helpful. For example, in 2017, NIJ published an article on missing persons, Finding the Nation's Missing. For those of you not as familiar with Namus, you may find the article informative. It describes the program's history, including the impetus for creating the data system, and highlights success stories. Second, I wanted you to be aware of a white paper authored by a former NIJ fellow examining the reporting and investigating of missing Indigenous people. The paper provides important information on the state of the problem, resources for finding missing persons, and provides an overview of federal and state laws addressing missing persons. And third, I encourage everyone to register for the Department's upcoming Violence Against Women Tribal Consultation. During that 4-day week, on Thursday, August 19th, NIJ-funded researchers from the University of Nebraska at Omaha will be presenting their findings on the scope of missing Native Americans in Nebraska. The team will be describing the practical and methodological challenges to consider when examining data on missing Indigenous persons. They will also present rates of reported Native American missing persons, case contexts over the study period as well. Once again, if you've not registered, I encourage you to do so. Next slide, please. Another important study I wanted to bring to your attention has to do with Namus. With funding from the Office on Violence Against Women, Namus staff were able to examine circumstances and characteristics of the Namus data. The study was implemented primarily to provide information on what system improvements and expansions may be needed to the system to help improve responses to and resolution of cases that are published in the database, in which violence is a contributing factor. The ECHO study aimed to enhance our understanding of violent missing person and unidentified person cases and any differences that may be found between violent and nonviolent cases. In addition, it's expected to help improve NAMUS data collection, improve or enhance services for law enforcement and medical examiners and others that use the system, including families of ones that have gone missing. We anticipate this research brief to be published in the fall of 2021. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to share that NIJ is working on a homicide paper that will specifically be looking at American Indian Alaska Native homicide statistics. The report is also expected to speak to underreporting and misclassification of these cases in the different data sources or systems. We'll also be collaborating on these efforts with our CDC colleagues. One other study we're eager to undertake at NIJ is examining death investigations in general and tribal communities specifically, looking at the differences across actors such as medical examiners, coroners, and law enforcement, and the jurisdictions in which they occur. Ideally, this report would provide an overview of the federal, state, and tribal mandates, laws, policies, or practices for reporting a death. It would also provide an overview of standards and practices of death investigations, such as the types of death investigations, the methods or the tests used and applied, death classifications, and the evidence to determine the classification and turnaround time. This is especially important around racial and ethnic identification of decedents and how these policies and practice impact the accurate reporting of race and ethnicity. And finally, I'd like to let you know that our sister agency, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, is working on a new report titled Homicide in the United States that will update a number of the tables and figures that have been produced in the past by them using the supplementary homicide report data that Lori mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, I don't have an expected publication date, but hopefully it will be published shortly. With that, I can turn things back over to Marcia.
Thank you. This is Lori, and Marcia had to step away for a second, so I'm going to hand the presentation over to Russ Myers with FBI.
All right, thanks, Lori. Hello again, everyone. So next up, I wanted to discuss some 2020 NCIC American Indian and Alaska Native missing person statistics. Next slide. So as laid out in the Crime Control Act of 1990, the FBI is required to release an annual statistics report related to missing and unidentified persons. This report is publicly available on the FBI's website, and if you do an internet search for 2020 FBI Missing Person Report, it should be the first link that presents itself. Next slide. There's a lot of information presented in this report, but what I wanted to focus on today is the data related to missing American Indian and Alaska Natives. This is one page of the report, and as you can see, we have the 2020 entry statistics broken down by different age groups, as well as by sex and by race. The first section is 0 to 17 and 18 years and older. The second section is 0 to 20 and 21 years of age and older. And the bottom section shows the totals for all ages combined. You can see in the columns we have the female, and Indian is for race code of I. So you see the female totals for Indians was 5,295 for 2020. Indian males was 4,276, and we had 4 individuals of unknown sex entered in as well. And one thing I wanted to point out at the bottom there, you can see the total entries of missing persons into the NCIC system for all races was 433,000. So that's 433,000 individual entries into the system over all entries and ages. So that's quite a large amount of individuals. Next slide. So as we looked at previously, of the 9,575 Native American entries made into NCIC in 2020, 55% of those were female and 45% were male. And you'll see later that even though we had more female entries, there are more active males currently active in the system than females, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Next slide. So of those 5,295 females entered, 78% were under the age of 18. And for the males, the 4,276 males that were entered, 69% of those were under the age of 18. Next slide. Here you can see a breakdown by category for all sexes. As you can see, the juvenile category made up 71% of the entries for 2020, followed next by the other category. So between those were 88% of your entries between those two categories. Next slide. And finally, at the end of 2020, the end of 2020 active record counts, you can see there were 578 females that were active and 918 males for a total of 1,496. Just again, I just want to remind you again that records stay, all those active records are from any point in time, not just 2020. Missing person records stay in the system until the entering system takes action on that record. I will point out, I just pulled fresh numbers yesterday, and as of yesterday, we have 935 males active in the system and 600 females. So we're at 1,535 currently. I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Lori.
Marcia?
Sure, I think my computer is now working again. I apologize, everybody. I am technologically challenged, and it keeps kicking me out of this webinar. So thanks so much for that information, Russ. Very enlightening in terms of especially the data about the ages of the folks who have been reported missing, with the vast majority of them being under the age of 18. So now I'm going to turn the screen over to BJ Spommer, who's the director of NIJ's Namus. BJ?
Great. Thank you, Marcia. And good afternoon. I'm grateful for the opportunity to provide an update on Namus's reporting efforts today. If you could click on the next slide, please. Chuck's already given you an overview of the Namus database and the type of cases and information it contains. So I'll just touch on the tribal data fields in Namus before moving on to our reports. In December of 2018, new data fields were added to Namus to better capture information on missing persons who are enrolled in or affiliated with a state or federally recognized tribe, missing persons who went missing from tribal land, or who had a primary residence on tribal land. And for unidentified decedent cases, it can also be noted if remains were found on tribal land. Next slide, please. And the link on this slide, which will be included in your handout, will take you to a page that describes these data collection efforts and fields and will allow you to download monthly reports on the Namus tribal data, in addition to monthly reports on all American Indian and Alaska Native cases in the system, regardless of tribal enrollment or affiliation. Next slide, please. And then the link on this slide will take you to those same reports, but also to monthly reports for all case types and all demographics of all missing, unidentified, and unclaimed persons in the Namus system. Next slide. From this slide, you'll see the increase in published American Indian and Alaska Native cases in Namus since January of 2020. This is largely due to efforts to enter existing long-term cases into Namus, many of which predate the system itself. Approximately 95% of all missing persons entered into Namus have been missing 1 year or more. Next slide, please. And in the interest of time, we won't go through all of these reports in detail. They're all available for you to download anytime, but I've included some snips so you can see the type of data each report contains. This report for all American Indian and Alaska Native cases will show you, for example, the states with the highest number of cases in Namus, along with some specific demographic information. So again, for example, for missing person cases, you can see from this report that the majority of all of the cases are involving missing males. Next slide, please. And from this snip of the unidentified decedent report, you can see that the states with the highest number of cases entered into Namus are Arizona and California, for example. Now, keep in mind, those aren't necessarily the states with the highest number of cases. They're just the states with the highest number of cases entered into Namus, which, as Lori and Chuck mentioned, is not federally mandated. There are currently only 10 states that mandate the use of Namus. So for the majority of the states and jurisdictions, the use of Namus is voluntary. Next slide, please. And in the final page of the American Indian and Alaska Native report, you'll see unclaimed person cases documented. These are cases that involve decedents who have been identified by name, but for whom no next of kin has been located to make death notification. So, for example, you'll see in this report, the majority of unclaimed person cases in Namus are also males, and 25% of those decedents were found on tribal land versus 75% who were found outside of tribal jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Another report you'll find from those links I shared earlier is this tribal case report. Now, this report includes details on every case published in Namus where missing persons are noted to be enrolled in or affiliated with a state or federally recognized tribe. So from the screenshots here, you can see an example of some of these reports. And of course, the reports are only as good as the data that's entered into Namus. So as of June 1st, when the last batch of reports were run, 113 of our American Indian and Alaska Native missing person cases had tribal information entered. But you'll see from these reports that you can get a great deal of information on those tribal citizens. We do want to make these reports more compelling, more complete, so we do need the help of families and tribal leaders and tribal law enforcement agencies to populate these data fields so that we can give more information back to the communities. So from these screenshots, you'll see some of the examples of the data that we provide. The first page on the report will give you combined totals for all cases in NAMUS. So all males and females who have tribal enrollment or affiliation information will be on this first page. The next two pages will break those same statistics down by sex. So there'll be a page for males and a page for females. And then the next page will provide aggregate statistics by tribe. So for instance, when you download the report, you'll notice that the Navajo Nation has entered the most missing person cases into NAMUS for their tribal members. And then finally, the last page lists the name of every missing person alphabetically by tribe. So this page gives tribal leaders easy access to every citizen entered from NAMUS who's been missing from their sovereign nation. And it allows tribal leaders to quickly identify cases of individuals they know are missing but are not yet entered into NAMUS so that those entries can be made. So again, these links and these handouts will be made available, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you need those links again or you have any other questions about these reports. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide this update, and I'll turn things back over to Marcia.
So much, BJ. There's just a lot of great information coming out of NAMUS in terms of tribal affiliation in the new data fields that were added back in 2019. One of the projects that OLJ is working on with Jason O'Neill, who's the director of BIA Office of Justice Services, one of our task force members, and who is on today, and others within the Department of Interior and tribal law enforcement, is to be able to get all the rest of that information for the missing American Indians and Alaska Natives populated so that tribes can see specifically all of the tribal members that have been reported to NAMUS, keeping in mind it's generally a voluntary system, but at least gives them an idea of who's been reported, and then be able to make sure that we have all the people that are reported missing in the right location. So thanks so much for that work on behalf of that. And our final presenter for this section is Matt Lysenkowski of DOJ's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. Matt?
Thanks, Marcia. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Lysenkowski. I'm the Senior Advisor for Tribal Affairs for the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, or COPS office, here in the U.S. Department of Justice. We've been assisting Operation Lady Justice with engaging tribal law enforcement as part of our task force efforts. And we've also been assisting with the education and outreach task by helping the Operation Lady Justice website be updated and include relevant information around data and research, as well as education and resources. And so I'm just going to talk for a brief minute about those pages that we have on our website. You can see the link to the website there. The data and research page that we have on the OLJ website includes information about NCIC and Namus, as well as tribal and state task forces. So as Russ had mentioned earlier, information about the NCIC system itself and the missing person file is posted on the site. And the information that BJ just presented is also included on the site, including links to their monthly trend data report. We also have an area on the data and research page that includes information from tribal and state task forces, many of which contain data analysis in their reports. So you're welcome to visit that page and view any of those resources we have available. And just this morning and this afternoon, we updated that page to include 3 new documents as well that I'll mention. One is an infographic based on the NCIC 2020 missing person, missing American Indian Alaska Native summary information that Russ has been presenting and talking about thus far. And there's also a quick reference document on there about federal and NGO data systems that are available. And then finally, one of the papers that Tina had mentioned on missing persons from NIJ is also now on the website as well. In addition to the data and research page on the OLJ website, we also have an education and resources page. with numerous fact sheets, dozens of fact sheets on various topics. And Russ had mentioned in one of his slides during his presentation, we do have information, fact sheets on NCIC and the UCR as well. We have fact sheets on the Namus system, as well as fact sheets on CDC's data systems, the NVDRS and the NISVS that Delight and Laura presented on as well. We also are looking to continually update and post information on the website, so feel free to reach out to us at Operation Lady Justice at usdoj.gov. If you have reports you'd like us to share, requests for fact sheets that you'd like to see, or any other feedback about our website, we encourage you to submit those requests, questions, and comments. And we'll always be updating these pages and trying to keep them as fresh as possible. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Marcia to begin our Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Matt, for setting forth those pieces of information that are on our Operation Lady Justice website. Now we're going to, I know that's been a lot of information that we've given to you. You'll have access to all of these slides. And then I see that especially Laura has put a ton of the different links and resources in the chat so that you can access a lot of that information for yourself in these different links. What I'm going to do now is take questions and answers from anybody who may have them on the information that's been presented or about data sources in general. So if you have a question, please either type it in the chat, or if you can let the facilitators know that you wish to ask a question, and they can unmute your line. I'm going to turn this over to Lori McPherson of the U.S. Marshal Service, who's going to facilitate our questions and answers. Lori?
All right, thanks, Marcia. And I believe we have about 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. So if you have a question, I know we've been fielding some of them in the Q&A. If you have a question for any of the panelists, go ahead and raise your hand. Be actually the easiest way for us to navigate this. Or if you would like to type your question, you can do that as well, and we will call on the appropriate person to answer it. So I'll give a minute to see if anybody raises their hand or puts a question in the chat. All right, to our behind the scenes tech folks, do you see anybody with a hand raised?
Yes, if we can go ahead and unmute Catherine Edwards. I believe she has a question.
Thank you. Go ahead, Catherine.
We're still just waiting to unmute her at this time. One moment.
And as you're asking questions, remember to unmute on your computer screen as well as on your phone if you're dialed in. All right, Catherine, we're going to come back to you. I see Carmen Harvey.
One more moment on that. Lori, sorry, there's a technical glitch happening apparently.
All right.
Hello? Hello?
Hello. Carmen?
Yes.
Hi, Carmen. What's your question?
I have several questions, and I can't remember who's all these questions go to. I was just jotting them down. But one of my questions was, you know, we've had cases to where several cases where law enforcement doesn't refer cases of being murdered onto the investigation, I would say probably the FBI or OSBI, whatever, what have you, wherever it goes next to get these cases investigated. I think, at their own discretion, they hang on to those cases and don't refer them out to get them investigated. And even times where law enforcement are involved in the murder of our Native people, they're not always held accountable to where they're off duty and they're still on duty, and then it stays within the city of making that decision of that they had the right to murder an individual and was still on the job at the same time, which then reflects anger in the community, especially when it's a Native community, and not involving the family and letting them know what's happening. It's become something that's happened over and over in Indian country. And I heard one of the presenters say that it is, I guess voluntary or what have you to make that decision to move it forward to an investigation, which when it doesn't go into that direction of being investigated, that's when the community, our Native people, get angry. And then we feel like, why is it that as Natives that our cases never get, investigated, and into why is it the community law enforcement aren't held accountable to where, they need to step back and let another, I guess, organization come in and investigate it, because, it's the good old boy system. And I'm from Oklahoma, and my name is Carmen Harvey, and I've been with MMIP for about 6 years now. And, that was one of my questions, and that it has come up in Oklahoma recently. This has happened, and it's ongoing right now, that people are very angry at what has happened in this community. And that was my question, is why is it that they hang on? Is there anybody over them that is going to make them be accountable to move that forward into an investigation?
Right. Carmen, I'm going to turn your question over to Marcia for a response. So Marcia, go ahead.
Hi, Carmen. It's a really good question. I was a prosecutor in Indian country in Montana, first as a county prosecutor and then as an AUSA in Indian country. And so I worked a number of years with the FBI, with CIA, OJS, and with tribal police. And as I understand your question, it's a concern that maybe an event occurs, the community believes it to be a murder case, an investigation that should occur, and that either tribal police, BIA police, or FBI is not investigating it and decides to close it. And what can be done about that? Is that kind of the underlying question?
Yeah, well, that plus, it was, information was withheld. I mean, they even had like this media meeting with, local news stations, and didn't even, the family found out about what actually happened to their son through the news, when the news aired. And it was, why do our Native people have to be left out when it comes to their family, and they have to wait and wait and wait. And why is it that they had to shoot him several times and, and not, shoot to kill a young man and not give a family answers and in the respect and the dignity and all those things, and cause the community to go into a protest against their own authorities in their community to give answers and results, and to have to go that far with it because they weren't being accountable to referring it somewhere else, and so that it could be investigated, not to but in the community it has always had this racial strife, and I just want to know why it is that, and this is just not one. I mean, there's several law enforcement, and we're not talking just tribal, we're talking state, city, that will just withhold that case and not refer it out for investigation. And we need answers, and we don't get answers when it's local.
Mm-hmm. So I think the easy answer to that question is that the family should never be denied information that is able to be shared with them on a case involving one of their loved ones. Most of all the law enforcement agencies have, as you know, victim specialists and who work with victims and families in cases, and it's their job to keep the family informed with the information that law enforcement can share with them. I can't speak to the specifics of the cases that you're talking about, but there's always accountability for law enforcement agencies. Some of it is obviously much better communication, cross-jurisdictional agreements, discussions and understanding who has jurisdiction and kind of where the status of those cases are going before it ever gets to the media. Families should never, ever be in the position of learning what happens to a case or what the outcome of the case is from the media. That's just not appropriate in any way, shape, or form. I know that Jason O'Neill, who's the head of CIA Office of Justice Services and is one of our task force members, is on the call. I don't know if he is available, but Jason, if you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share on that, that would be great. And we could also suggest that maybe there could be a conversation about some of those specific cases with the FBI, because we actually have one of our task force members is an FBI executive director of the FBI, the number 3 person within the FBI, for conversations about that as well. Jason, are you able to unmute and add anything to that? Jason is on his phone, and I know that we're all having some issues at the moment with kind of the platform. So I'm not sure if he's able to do that.
I can move on to the next.
I have other, go ahead.
Marcia, what would you prefer? Move on to the next question, or I don't know who else is trying to speak there.
I have a couple other questions.
All right, we want to make sure that they're focused on the topic of this listening session. So are they data-related questions?
This is related to data.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
And for our MMIP chapters in Oklahoma, we have come together to do intakes on our cases, and we see that we need to start putting that information into like a spreadsheet, like we do our missing and murdered, and see where that all is happening. Because I do a lot of the missing children, mostly teenagers, and I see that there's been a revolving door in that, where the kids will run away, which we know they're at risk, and then we find them, they return home, and then they run away again. And then the parents get frustrated because there's no resources available for them to help their children. And I think that needs to be probably, I don't know, resolve somehow to where the tribes can maybe find resources for those needs for the children that run away, and then the things that they face when they're out there, the risks and the trafficking that comes along with it, and those resources need to be available, and there's none available for Indian country. But with that information that we do take on each of these cases, that is something that we do that I haven't heard anybody talk about in the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples area. But that's something that we're doing in that part. But we all do have our own data collections within the different areas of Oklahoma in that area. And with the MMIP coordinators, can we get sent the list of those MMIP coordinators if those are the new ones? Because I asked for the one for Oklahoma and I got the name, but I didn't get a number on that person.
Yeah, I'm going to hand this back over to Marcia in a second because I know we're kind of at time. To the best of my understanding, there is not currently an MMIP coordinator in Oklahoma, at least not under the Attorney General's initiative. So that may explain the lack of a contact.
Well, I know
Marcia,
Patty Buell was there last time, but they said it was a man that replaced her.
Yeah, Patty is no longer there. I'm going to hand it over to Marcia to wrap us up because we're at time. And Carmen, thank you for your questions. And everybody else, Shirley, I see your question. I know we had one other hand raised that we were not able to get to. If you put those questions in the chat, some of them we may be able to address in the chat. Some of them we may have to follow up on later on. And some of them are very broad and we may not be able to get a solid answer to you, but we'll do the best we can. So Marcia, I am going to hand it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Lori. Put your questions in the chat and we will continue to monitor and answer as we can going forward. So right now we are going to take a really short break. Our listening section starts in 7 minutes at 1 o'clock. We will be back for the portion in which our folks who have registered to speak are going to present their testimony and their conversations today. So right now we're going to be on break until 1 o'clock, and everybody be sure to be back. We're going to be calling speakers in the answer in which they registered. And if we have time towards the end of the session, if you haven't registered and still want to make comments, we'll allow that as well. So thanks everybody for this morning, and we'll be back in just a few minutes.
I also help coordinate some of the Administration for Children and Families response to MMIP. I just wanted to provide a quick update in reaction to some of the questions that came up around law enforcement communication with families. That was also identified as an issue for the task force when we were created, which led to the creation of a work group on best practices for law enforcement. So right now, we're actively working with federal, local law enforcement agencies, as well as families who have been affected by MMIP and social service providers and experts on creating a guide for law enforcement agencies to use to better communicate with families of MMIP victims and survivors, and making sure that it's done in a way that's culturally respectful and is, getting families the information that they need. So that is in process, and hopefully, by the end of Operation Lady Justice is going to be a product that local law enforcement agencies around the U.S. are going to have access to and use to improve the communication and avoid some of the issues that you had mentioned earlier, Carmen. So thank you for raising that, and just wanted to let you know that it's something that we're thinking about and we're working on as well.
All right, thanks, Travis. And before I turn it back over to Marcia, I believe she's back on. There was a question before the break about the MMIP coordinator in Oklahoma, and thanks to Ernie Wyand, who's our coordinator out in Montana. He did provide me the updated information for that individual, so that information as well as the email address is in the Q&A section. So Carmen or anybody else who may want that, that is there. So Marcia, are you available to get us started again? Okay. She can hear us, but she cannot, we cannot hear her. Daryl, let's hang on 30 more seconds and then we can get started.
Marcia, if you can hear us, you're probably through the...
Can you guys hear me?
There you go. Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Okay. I think I can talk, but I just can't be on video because my computer just keeps kicking me back out again. So we'll go ahead and get started. If we want to go ahead and put up our next slide. So what we're going to do this afternoon, as we talked about during the registration process, and then again once this morning, the speakers are going to be called in the order in which they have registered. We have had a really good turnout this afternoon with approximately 25 of our folks have registered indicating they wanted to speak today, so that will be great. At the end, if we have some additional time, we're scheduled to go till 6 o'clock p.m. If there's still time before that, then if folks have been on today and have not registered to speak but wish to speak, we'll take that testimony at that time. So we put together the list in order of registration. So the slide that I'm hoping is up would show the order of the first speakers, and we will leave that up for a few minutes so that folks can note the order in which they will be called. And then the next slide will show our second set of speakers, again, in the order in which folks were registered. We can leave that second slide up to note the order in which they will be called. And just note that we have not set a time limit on speakers. We just ask that you be mindful of the number of people who have signed up to speak today. And note that given the number of interested registered speakers, that it may not be possible to get through the entire list of speakers in today's session. We will stay and hope we can get through all of that. If not, we will reconvene for the remainder of the registered speakers at a later date. And everybody who is registered to speak will be given that opportunity so that we can make sure that there's enough time. And we're asking folks to, to really address, if you can, kind of the issues that we're talking about data and the different issues around that area. You can also submit a written statement. You can email it to operationladyjustice@usdoj.gov, and that will be included in the notes and up on the website for this session as well. So again, if we don't get through all of our speakers today, we'll continue with the session at a later date. Now, if we can go to our final slide, it talks about the 4 questions that we set out as being potentially helpful for framing responses, or you can certainly address data issues as you choose. That's kind of really what we're talking about here today. And we are going to put that slide up. It was also on your registration, so if in fact you wish to speak to those specific 4 questions, certainly feel free to do so, or address kind of the data issues as you see fit. So we'll go ahead and hear from those who have registered to speak. And Daryl, if you could call on our first speaker today, that would be great.
Certainly, Marcia. The first 3 individuals designated to speak are not currently on the call. So we'll go to the first one, Francesca Mernon. You see that you're available. Would you like to enable video or just use audio portion? We're going to be unmuting your line here in a moment. Your line, oh, your line is
Indian
unmuted,
Health Board and
Francesca.
the urban, oh, Daryl, can you hear me?
Yes, it can.
Okay, great. I just wanted to provide, Saddle Indian Health Board and the Urban Indian Health Institute have decided to provide a just written comment today, so we'll be following up with our written comments later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker on the call, Dr. Dwight Sanders. Be unmuting your line here. Your line is unmuted. Can you hear us, Dr. Sanders? Your telephone may be muted on your end. Can you hear us, Mr. Sanders, Dr. Sanders? Okay, we'll move on to the next. Carmen Harvey, your name is on there as well. We did hear from you in the Q&A. If you would like to provide your testimony, we'll go ahead and unmute your line. I believe Carmen did drop the line during the break here. So the next one would be Renee Bork with NCVC. Renee, are you on the line? We'll go ahead and unmute yourself. Let's just take one more moment here. She's listed as NCVC Bork to the host. There you go. You are unmuted. Renee, you on? You are unmuted. Your line is unmuted, Renee. Can you hear us? Okay, maybe having some technical issues on your end. We can go ahead and pause that and get back to you perhaps. Just chat us that you'll be available. The next one will be Bernadette Lassart. Bernadette, we'll go ahead and unmute your line there. Your line is unmuted. Can you hear us, Bernadette?
Yes, I can. I just put in the chat that I can speak at the next session, but what I have to say is actually just a minute or two. My name is Bernie Lassart. It's really not Lassart. It's just one Lassart. But I'm from the Coeur d'Alene tribe in northern Idaho. And I just want to thank you for this opportunity and this listening session, because I've learned so much information that I can actually use some of this for the MMIW Next Steps conference that I have scheduled for this October. That will involve a lot of law enforcement statewide, actually Pacific Northwest, as well as tribal leaders, attorneys, U.S. attorneys, FBI, and legislators. But this conference is, the focus of this is, we all know tribes all over, we all are having the same issues. And what is the next steps? And so Idaho is working together with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, as well as the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence and the 5 tribes, to address this and to make a plan for Idaho's response to MMIW/P. But anyway, I just want to thank you for the information on Namus, as well as the clearinghouse, the state's clearinghouse, missing persons clearinghouses. Excuse me. I think that's important, as everybody knows that collecting data and the need for one data source nationwide is needed. Anyway, I just want to thank everybody, and I'll have more to share at the next session. I was hoping to have some confirmation of whether Deb Holland was going to be able to attend, but I don't have that confirmation yet. But anyway, I'll have more to say at the next session. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments. Certainly. Marcia, anything to add there? Otherwise, we can go to the next speaker, who is on the line, actually, is Jennifer Germain. Jennifer,
sounds good. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Bernadette, for being on the call today. if you have comments regarding data, be sure and have them spoken today, because it looks like a majority of the speakers that we have registered are not on the call. And so this session will very likely end today. So if you have data related kind of issues or questions or concerns, be sure and speak today. We can put you back on the list as well. Yeah, and Daryl, that would be great if you could go to Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. State Representative Jennifer Germain from Arizona's Legislative District 18. I am the chair of our Legislative Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous People, and I am White Earth Ojibwe. We submitted our 518-page state report to the governor, and then also up to Operation Lady Justice in November of 2020. We've got a very robust partnership with the Arizona State University School of Criminology, School of Social Work, and Indian Law program out of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. And we were able to employ 15 Indigenous graduate students to help us do our research. We looked at all of the databases that were talked about earlier in this presentation, but then we also went out and did community listening sessions with our tribes and really traveled the state as we could before the COVID lockdown shut us down. This legislative session, we're able to pass a statewide missing children's statute, which will require all of our law enforcement agencies to report up to NCIC, Namus, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children within 2 hours of a child going missing. And we define child as juveniles under the age of 18, but also individuals who have disabilities under the age of 26. And that's per our state statute that defines individuals with disabilities under the juvenile statutes until they're age 26 and they're aged out of our juvenile disability system. So we are really, really excited about that. And we've also required our state, county, and local law enforcement agencies to share missing children data with our tribal law enforcement agencies. So that will take effect. Our effective date for new legislation is September 28th in the state of Arizona. So that will go statewide in effect September 28th. And we're really excited about that. And then we also pushed through an expansion of, they're called the Arizona Health Education Centers, to support Indian Health Services, Native Health, and Section 638 healthcare centers within our tribal communities, because we found a severe lacking of sexual assault nurse practitioners in our rural areas. And we also found a severe lacking of social workers who can follow up on child abuse and domestic violence cases in our rural communities. So this will allow the University of Arizona Medical School to be able to train and equip our rural healthcare workers with these skills to be able to respond within their own communities and to really respond within their own tribes. So we're really excited about all of that. Altogether, we came up with 87 legislative recommendations for the state of Arizona. We got 4 through this legislative session, and this is going to be a multi-year process for us, but we are working very, very closely with our Operation Lady Justice liaison here in the state of Arizona. And we're working very closely with our tribes. Half of our committee are enrolled tribal members from local Arizona tribes. So we are making sure that we are really integrating everybody into the discussion that needs to be part of this discussion. And we are really focused on wraparound services, because that is where our state government can really make a huge difference in providing those wraparound services and support to families who are going through these crises. So I have emailed the links to all of our report and the enacted laws to the Operation Lady Justice submit written comments email address. And I'm happy to post those links into the chat if one of the panelists would want to share those with everybody else. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm so honored to be a part of this group.
Thank you so much for those comments, Jennifer. Oh, Marcia, you're back on, I see. Wonderful.
I'm trying. Thank you so much, Jennifer. You guys have done some amazing work there with your report. I believe that we have that on our Operation Lady Justice website page. And I think we've got this in the chat where folks can access that as well. So we're anxious to see kind of what your next step of work is. Talking about kind of the wraparound services, figuring out why people are going missing, and being able to have those services when people return home, because as we know from the NCIC data, that is the vast majority of people. What are we doing to make sure we help with the resolution of the issues that led to that in the beginning? So thank you so much, Jennifer. Just really appreciate you being on. Okay, so where are we next in terms of speakers who might be on?
Marcia, we do have Renee's audio figured out, so we can go ahead and unmute Renee Bork on CVC.
Perfect.
Your line is unmuted.
Okay, can you hear now?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you. My name is Renee Bork. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation here in Oklahoma. I would like to start out first by apologizing up front to any of my elders who are on the call today. My words are not meant to be disrespectful or to appear authoritative in demeanor, as I know my elders possess so much more knowledge than I do, and I humbly carry those teachings of my grandmother forward to help us grow and serve our communities humbly in a good way, as we have always done. I would also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the ancestral homelands of the Kickapoo Tribe of Oklahoma, the Absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, today known as Choctaw, Oklahoma, of which where I will be speaking from today. And I would like to take a moment just to thank everyone on the panel for working in this space to ensure that we're lifting the voices on this platform to honor Indian country victims. Your work does not go unnoticed. I have spent 20 years of victim services, with many of those years responding to cases involving missing persons and victims of homicide and murder. I've spent my entire adult career serving Indian country victims across the country in different capacities, as a federal victim specialist, as a tribal advocate, as a police officer, and as a state investigator. I feel like today I've come full circle with my position at the National Center for Victims of Crime as the director for the Victims Assistance to Support Tribes Center, known as the VAST, to build relationships and collaboration throughout Indian country for the betterment of victims and survivors. And I'm kind of just going to go off the talking points as you had them listed. So with the first question was, what information do AIA communities, tribes, grassroots organizations, law enforcement, and others need? This is not a simple ask. We have 574 tribal nations who each have their own history, government, resources, cultural practices, treaties, and issues within their communities. And I am not here to speak for every tribal community, but I can speak on my experience of serving MMIP families in Indian country for many years and providing that direct response to victims, families, and law enforcement agencies. And I would hope to use my experience to give the perspective from a different lens of the different dimensions of this complex issue. And each of the following sectors are going to have a very specific and different need, but they're all key actors in addressing the MMIP. Law enforcement's information is going to be very specific in regards to response, investigative processes, and traditional justice. But law enforcement should provide victim services with a more prominent role in responses, including reports of missing persons. Often victim services may have valuable information regarding victimization unknown to law enforcement, which may be used to provide that victim-centered approach for the victim and the family. This will ensure coordination and connection with family and promote trauma-informed practices. In addition to greater exposure and integration with victim services, law enforcement should identify family members and points of contact for Native families. This is a crucial component, as we know that extended family culturally plays a huge role in our tribal community. And this can be key in providing those culturally relevant responses. But this can also create many barriers when misinformation is being passed along. So it's key for law enforcement to work collaboratively with experienced and trauma-informed victim service providers to ensure that the family is appropriately identified and informed. An example is the next of kin may not always be the appropriate point of contact for family. As I've served many families, in one example, a victim was raised by her aunt and uncle. Her mother had been deceased for many years, and her father was never involved in her life. But that was the information that law enforcement had as the next of kin. Providing the father the information caused much confusion and misinformation within the community, which created more trauma for family members. Having that collaborative, trauma-informed approach can minimize re-traumatization and assist families during this deeply traumatic time. Identifying minors versus adults. We have a huge disconnect with young people as the age of 16 and 17 being treated as adults by community members, by law enforcement, and by courts from reporting to response. We need to ensure that we're identifying the age and we're acting accordingly. The reporting missing person is critical to data to better identify the adults versus children in this movement. In terms of grassroots organizations, depending on their role, they will need different information than law enforcement. Within the tent of grassroots organizations, they're direct victim service providers, policymakers, activists, healthcare, and support groups. We've seen a whole array of organizations that become involved in this movement. However, just as with law enforcement, identifying the role of the victim's family is going to make a vast difference in what services and support are needed. Ensuring that grassroots organizations are connected with law enforcement and the victim's family is critical and should be standard in any case. The standard should always be collaboration to create a continuum of care to demystify the services and processes available to the family. Activists should coordinate with victim service and family members in a manner that will not interfere with ongoing services, but use their voice to ensure system accountability for the missing loved one. And to take this conversation into a larger space, I believe that regardless of your position, understanding what we need and what is best for the victim's family, which can be very different, are huge disconnects in many cases that I've seen. And this contributes to the lack of communication between agencies, desperately affecting the data being collected. We can never overlook jurisdictional issues in Indian country. This is often misunderstood within community members and families who may not be well versed in Indian country jurisdiction, leaving questions as to why an agency did not respond or why something may appear nothing is happening. Following up on our previous point, we cannot cookie cut Indian country. The response and resources will vary from community to community, and this is extremely critical for data collection. For example, if a BIA law enforcement program under a 638 contract responds to a missing person, this could look completely different than a self-governing tribal police department. And then if you throw Public Law 280 response into the mix, that's going to look different than the other two mentioned. Approaches are going to differ. Even if you have two reservations that are adjacent and share a border, the resources, the culture, and the response is all going to be different. Again, creating some additional measures we need to put in place for data collection. Law enforcement, victim services, and land status all play a role in the lives of response and Indian country victims. And it's generally a huge piece where true implications are overlooked. Victims become confused about services they should have when they may not apply to their jurisdiction. Victims and families need to be connected to experienced victim service providers to stay involved in a process that may span across years. In federal and some tribal cases, some laws are afforded to victims that may not be known to those working in this line of work every day. Urban Indian organizations should track tribal affiliation, as this is a crucial part of our tribal identity as Native people. We can also identify additional resources for families who may not reside on their reservation or in their area by identifying the tribal affiliation. How can we use data to better understand communities at a local level? Well, historically, the lack of data in Indian country has been the center of not identifying the actual level of victimization in our tribal communities. While listening to everybody today on the panel and all the information regarding the different reporting and data platforms with NCIC and CGIS, Namus, to name a few, we're missing a huge component regarding the platforms and databases of tribal nations. Many tribes do not have the capacity to fund data collection or analyzing the data. Expertise or resources for data collection, gathering, and analysis. Generally, the only resources available are from federally funded grants, which in turn give that ownership of data to the federal government. This clearly impedes sovereignty. Think of it this way. The United States would not be expected for Mexico to be the keeper of our nation's data. Therefore, we should not expect the federal government to keep the data for our tribal nations. We must find ways to offer this expertise and resources to tribes in which they have ownership of the data. We know that the manner of data collection is just as important in ensuring the quality of data, and that having access and ownership over culturally relevant data is empowering and will help us to grasp the actual scope of MMIP. This will also help with funding, as many agencies may utilize this data for grant writing. The current manner of data collection continues to lump all of Indian country into one category of issues, which does a disservice and risk inaccuracy for experiences in each community. To further this point, when we are doing research, advocacy, policy work, I think it's crucial for each organization to honor the specific area they are working with and to state that they do not speak for all of Indian country, as this has led to so much misunderstanding and misinformation regarding MMIP. For example, there is a data set that is repeatedly stated that AIAN women are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than any other race. This report was specific to one small county in South Dakota and is not representative for all of Indian country, but it continues, sorry, I lost my spot. It continues to be the data quoted. MMIP is a crisis of data, urgency, and scale. Collecting data on what's going on in communities, each community in terms of missing persons or murder cases separately, so that the real problem can be better understood. Some communities do not have this problem, or they have very low numbers. And this creates a silo of information and services, which is not conducive for tribal nations. Data can be transformative and can demonstrate gaps in services. Although the Tribal Resource Tool is not a data collection tool or program, the gaps analysis conducted on the Tribal Resource Tool by the National Congress of American Indians was representative that we are still in need of health services and domestic and sexual violence services in Indian country. Linking the knowledge that we're gaining with the TRT and the National Congress of American Indians and advocacy, providing that report to the public has been a useful tool for additional resources, especially related to urban Indian communities. How do we convey a more complete picture of who is missing or murdered to include men and boys, Two-Spirit, and LGBTQ? The National Center in Victim Assistance to Support Tribes, the center that I manage, is built on the strength of our partnerships. We can be inclusive by intentionally seeking out partnerships led by LGBTQ and Two-Spirit advocates, by being aware of the language that we use, and aside from outreach, ensuring that our data collection and the categories make space for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ individuals. Some actionable steps are asking who's in the room. If you work with survivors, what are the demographics? Who feels comfortable accessing your services? Who doesn't? Who are your partners? Where is your outreach occurring? Is the language you use in materials and interactions with clients and staff inclusive? And what resources are you sharing? And finally, how can we work together to understand data context and limitations so we can identify what problems exist versus those that have been portrayed or perceived to exist? Again, my 20 years in direct service will always lead me back to suggesting working with your tribal victim service, boots on the ground advocates. Many of our MMIP cases have a direct correlation to the historical epidemic of domestic and sexual abuse in our communities. These issues and having this data can support our tribal service programs with grant funding, awareness, and education and overall safety. With these concrete actions, we can better serve our nations with proactive methods and support and services for victims. Perhaps MDTs and the support of tribal leadership can greatly assist with data. Although victim data is and should always be confidential, it can be collected and maintained for each tribal nation to specifically state what their exact issues are in their community. To assume that each nation is facing a crisis of MMIP is a disservice to the numerous other crime victims that within nations and a disservice to survivors. Researchers and collectors of data that work in the space of victimization and specific disciplines within this field need to coordinate with the tribal leaders and the tribal victim services in the tribal communities to better understand and identify the diverse issues and responses we have in Indian country. With coordination, rather than what can lead to objectification and white saviorism, we can honor the work and legacy that is being done rather to appear and reinforce the narrative that nothing is ever happening when we are just waiting for help. There are a lot of diehard advocates and law enforcement communities out there every day making their communities more informed, and we sometimes forget to weigh in on our strengths and our resiliency as Native people. We've been in this space fighting for recognition of MMIP for so many years. We need to continue to take ownership over our work and our legacy while working collaboratively with researchers and new partners who seek to work with us to address MMIP. And I would like for everyone today to feel renewed in this fight and to recognize the strides that we have made. Mado, thank you for allowing me the honor to speak in this space today. And may we all keep our missing relatives and families in thought and prayer every day while we make our communities safer.
Thank you so much, Renee, for those amazing comments. So much to unpack in there in terms of looking at data, solving problems, making sure we're all working together, tribal data sovereignty. There's so much within that statement that resonates in the work that needs to be done here. And we really appreciate your being on today and your sharing those thoughts. Your years of experience really are helpful to helping us know the path forward. Daryl, let's turn to our next speakers that we have on.
Certainly. The next one on the list and who is available is Desi Bond. Desi, your line has been unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Hi, thank you for having me today. My name is Desi Bond. My Yupik name is Ulichak. I am Blackfeet and Yupik. I'm from Dillingham, Alaska. I'm a tribal member of the Chilling tribe here in Dillingham. Like I said, I'm happy to be here today. Our tribe is the first in Alaska to adopt a community action plan. And part of the reason we're doing so is to formalize our organizational relationships so we can respond more appropriately to these incidents and work to quantify our experiences into usable data that demonstrates the impacts to our tribal families. In May, we had a name ceremony where we honored our tribal members. We called out 33 names on May 5th, and they were names that were just provided to us by families, with the earliest being from the mid-1970s. So we only know modern cases is not the true history. Our tribal population is currently 2,959, which means that we've lost more than 1% of our people to murder or going missing, and that those numbers are just those that are gone and not those that have left us behind. For those that we have lost, sorry, it's something that's near and dear to my heart. Like with saying in the opening prayers, many of us are here because we have either family or friends that are unfortunately on the list of those that are murdered and missing. At this time, we don't have any data, but we are working on it. We do have our list isn't just names of women or children. Sorry, I'm nervous, but there's names of men also. So we have missing brothers and uncles and dads and everything too. And so this is very important. I'm filling in for our tribal administrator Courtney. I've been involved with this from the beginning through a different organization, and now I'm fortunate enough to be able to be a tribal employee. But that's all I have for now. Liana for having me. Hello from Alaska.
Thank you so much for your comments. We're absolutely happy to have you on from Alaska. Your issues can in some ways be very different and in many ways be absolutely the same as what we have down here. We need to make sure, as several of our other speakers have noted, that we're tailoring responses as your communities need them. So we really appreciate you being on today. Okay, let's go ahead and go to our
Marcia, actually, Chairman Aaron Payman is back on the line and is available to provide some oral testimony. So
certainly, that would be great. Chairman Payman.
All right, I'm back. I apologize. I was all confused about the schedule, but I'm back. So Anin Buju Biwakaji Nishnagas. My name is Dr. Aaron Payman. I'm the chairperson of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. I also serve as the first vice president of the National Congress of American Indians, former chair of the HHS OMH Health Research Advisory Council, and former chair of the NIH Tribal Advisory. I currently serve on the NIH Tribal Advisory, and I'm also a member of the HHS Secretary Tribal Advisory. So data is stuff that we've been focusing on for quite a while. So I want to focus on the data aspect of what we're talking about today and the importance of properly operationalizing data collection related to American Indian Alaska Native populations. I'm a quantitatively trained statistician, and I did my own data crunching and analysis for my dissertation, including data rotations, use of expectation maximization, and relying on multiple and logistical regression analyses. So I'm in it deep. I also wrote a course in my undergraduate institution and taught political science research and statistics. And so during the COVID-19 pandemic and the opiate epidemic before that, it shows us the serious deficiencies in federal data collection related to public health and population statistics. The concept of American Indian ID is already complex, as most who fill out data boxes on forms that are collected are as a generic Pan-American Native American. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promise report points to the worst of the worst statistics for American and Alaska Natives as a generic concept on most measures like highest rates of suicide, alcoholism, accidents, low education attainment, chronic disease, and violence. But with the data that is not collected for tribal specific, it's likely much, much worse because public health data statistics focus generally on your purchase and referred service areas, which is your IHS service delivery area, and generally data is not collected for populations of American Indians outside of that. And so it's not likely to be accurate. It's likely to be a subset of the universe of our populations. So again, as a doctoral level statistically trained social scientist, I can tell you that while the pandemic has shown the high rates of vaccination, these results are, again, limited to the purchase and referred service areas. And so at first blush, it looks wonderful because our vaccination rates are higher than the general population. But again, it's only limited to our purchase and referred service area. For my tribe, that's 1/3 of my population. 2/3 of my population are not included in those statistics at all. And so you can begin to see the spuriousness and the importance of the way that you collect data. So operationalizing data collection is a challenging risk. However, it is essential. fundamental and foundational. Identifying a baseline to understand the importance of or prevalence of any phenomena is critical. Without this, our understanding is anecdotal and will undoubtedly lead to spurious results and inaccurate, unreliable. So let's dive deeper into looking at the pandemic for data collection for American and Alaska Natives as an example of why we should collect data more correctly for murdered and missing Indigenous. So first, the unit of measure during the pandemic is the individual who contracts COVID or who is vaccinated. And then public health statistics are collected at the county level. And states determine what question is asked. And so unfortunately, this subordinates tribal data collection to state data practices. And I can tell you in Michigan, when we first started on the pandemic, former president of Bay Mills, Brian Newland, and I admonished the state and pushed the state to start collecting, at least asking if they were American Indian Alaska Native. Before that, they were not asking that question. And so leaving it up to the practices at respective states is unacceptable. Again, the federal government generally collects on the data that you read in reports is generally data that's related to the Indian Health Service Purchase and Referred Service Area. But for my tribe, that's 15,000 of my members. We have 45,000, so 30,000 are not collected. The data is not collected for that 30,000. So this approach to collecting data is limited at best. It's erroneous at worst. This operationalization, that's not a word, collecting the data for our population would not pass an undergraduate statistics course, and they would be directed to go back and reconfigure their data collection. It also probably would not pass any IRB process. So legislation is critically needed to mandate comprehensive data collection at the critical incidence level. The variance in practices that we've talked about today is evidence of this. You heard in the presentations different ways data is collected, but the fact that it varies means that there needs to be a uniform practice for how data is collected with respect to murdered and missing Indigenous people. It should not be left to the benevolence of states. It should be required. Tribal citizenship must be collected, not just a Pan-American, American Indian Alaska Native, but specifically what tribe is that victim a member of. So this needs to be collected. And let's see, without tribal nation data collected, you simply cannot determine a baseline. Without a baseline, you have no way of knowing if you're improving or worsening in the incidence of murdered and missing Indigenous in Indian country. And so I also want to highlight that my tribe was one of the pilot projects, and we were grateful to be one of the MMIP pilots. We worked with Joel Postma, who's on the line, and also the U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice, to articulate a community response plan with a specific protocol to increase the likelihood of rescue. We also coordinated with the development of a critical incident report and follow-up with victim services, tribal behavioral health, and communications. We launched our plan during a special event that was joined with addresses from our Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, my two Michigan senators, Peters and Stabenow, our Governor of Michigan, our Attorney General of Michigan, and we were joined by U.S. Attorney for the Western District, Andrew Burge, who is also on the line. I also want to recognize the leadership of Brian Newland as president of Bay Mills Indian Community, as the pilot project included our two tribes. And we were ideal because we're located right on the northern border, because a lot of people can go missing across the border. So as a sovereign tribal nation, rather than as relegated as a domestic dependent, if a victim's citizen of an external sovereign, like a foreign nation, were murdered or missing, the U.S. State Department would be engaged as a matter of diplomatic relations. For tribal sovereigns, we expect to be treated like sovereigns with respect to surveillance, reporting, and data collection. Coordination with all relevant agencies is essential. Time is a critical factor as a variable in the critical incident of a murdered or missing person. Your probability of rescue reduces with minutes. Thus, precision in response requires the coordination protocols worked out in advance, and it will make the difference between rescue, recovery, and unfortunately never reaching a resolution. So tribes have resources. So if we are notified that one of our members is missing, we can join in the effort. And we aren't going to know that unless you're collecting tribal specific data. So I also want to share that ICWA, while their reporting is not perfect and it also needs some changes to come in compliance with the federal law, it does serve as a testament for how a federal law can mandate notification to respective tribes if it involves their citizens. And so we expect no less for MMIP data to be collected and reported to our respective tribes. So data collection needs to be operationalized correctly. Also, it should be mandated rather than voluntary. Anything less will result in data collection of a subset of our population while leaving out possibly more of our vulnerable populations who are away from our tribal service area and our headquarters and services. So just like asking non-white Hispanic data, I think we should ask if they're American Indian Alaska Native. If they say yes, then are you a member of a federally recognized tribe? If so, which tribe? And if not a member of a federally recognized tribe, if you're a member of a state recognized tribe. Without asking this series of demographic questions, American Indian Alaska Native citizens will continue to slip through the cracks. We understand we have the worst of the worst as it relates to MMIP, but I can imagine the actual data is going to be much, much worse because we aren't accurately collecting the data now. So that's my input, and I apologize for being confused earlier, and I appreciate you listening to my testimony. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chairperson Payment. Your background and your expertise is perfect for this issue, and the words that you're speaking in terms of limitations and data sovereignty are just so on point. The suggestion that you made about an ICWA type notification is something that we heard on another listening session, I believe, and something that we need to really see if there is a way to maybe put something like that together. Certainly a great idea. So thank you for being able to come back and beyond. We appreciate that. Okay, Daryl, do we have another speaker who's on for today?
Yes, Catherine Edwards. I know we had some difficulties with the Q&A portion, but I see you're listed and you are available. We'll go ahead and unmute your line.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Edwards, First Vice President for the Central Council Click and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska. I'm really happy to be here today. I was able to listen in on this morning, and while my head is swimming with all the information put at us really quickly, I have comments that I'd like to make. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Payment and for his comments. I agree with a lot of comments that he made wholeheartedly. I feel like that your baseline is a moving target. And I'm not sure how you're going to reconcile that across all those databases. For instance, we heard that the one has 5,000 entities that were reported missing in 2020, but it turned out to only be 1,500 cases that are missing. There are over 18,000 state, local, and tribal LEAs that are voluntarily reporting this data. And federal LEAs are required to report the crime data. But if they're voluntarily reporting, how do we know that it's getting reported in the information and chart that's given to us with the 5,000 people? Because it's not mandated that they have to report. Some states have to report, some don't. Federal LEAs are required to report. Now, this is interesting when it gets to Alaska, because in Alaska, we have a jurisdictional nightmare. And if a body lays in our community for more than 16 hours because law enforcement of any type can't get there, the crime scene becomes contaminated, and the coroner isn't able to determine the cause of death. So it goes as cause of death unknown or cause of death as suicide. So I'm wondering how that would get entered into the database. And we know and that predator is able to go on and continue to commit more crimes in our communities. The other thing that is striking to me, Chairman Payment talked about it a little bit, was service area. I was thinking about it earlier when we're talking about Alaska. We're talking about tribal lands. or some of these databases are if a person is on tribal lands when they go missing or this. So I'm wondering how that gets reported into anybody's database when you're talking about Alaska. Again, thinking about our tribe, we have over 33,000 tribal citizens, and more than half of them reside outside of Southeast Alaska. They're residing in Anchorage, California, and Washington. I saw on these charts earlier this morning, there's unidentified homicides in California. How do we know that that is not a Clinton and Hydel tribal citizen reporting there if you haven't been able to report to us that somebody is missing? I think this needs to be corrected. The data, I just swim in the amount of fixes that you're going to need to do across all these databases to be able to help us take care of this problem. I saw something reported this morning, the violent death system. And he mentioned something about stalking and victimization. This raises another question for me because I'm also the co-chair of our Violence Against Women Task Force for the tribe. So the stalking victimization, would that go in the database if the judge didn't grant the protective order, the victim is moved out of town and the stalker is moved on to the next victim? How are we capturing that data? I don't believe that anybody is. Our runaways, having been a foster mom myself, I had a runaway and I called local law enforcement to report this runaway, and they took a request to locate, but they informed me that they would not be actively looking for her. I don't know if she ended up in a database or not, but I found her by the next day by myself without help of any law enforcement. But I'm wondering about the runaways and what databases and how much that's helping anybody figuring out where they are. I know that we had a woman that was murdered. Her husband went on trial, but we couldn't convict him because we didn't have the body, and that body is yet to be found. I also know of another young woman in our community that went missing more than 3 years ago, and her body, and I'm assuming a body by now, as we heard Chairman Payman say, it's a matter of minutes, but she still has remained to be found. And I don't know if she's in anybody's database, but I know that she's a person. She's somebody's sister, she's somebody's auntie, and that family still mourns and tries to figure out what happened to her. And I don't know how many of you have been to Alaska, but you know, there's a lot of things that could happen to a body if it's left unattended in some of our communities that that I won't repeat here. So, and then the other thing is because I too work with victims and people, I'm wondering how much data is being collected on the internet and on children's games now, because a lot of our kids are being invited into these chat rooms, and the next thing we know, some adult male is picking them up and either murdering them or pushing them into human trafficking. Jurisdiction is a nightmare, and I know I heard the gentleman this morning talk about 433,000 tribal, or not tribal, so 433,000 people are missing. And I don't know, in the way it was presented, am I supposed to feel that are 1,500 that aren't appropriately, because I still don't know how, if it's not mandated to be in these databases, how you're counting these numbers. Are we not supposed to work on these projects that we're working on to find our missing tribal citizens? I think that the U.S. government has a trust responsibility to us that they need to help us with these broken systems and figure out how to not just clean up the data, but how to make it so that our people don't go missing anymore. Like I said, I think one of my big concerns is the tribal lands versus service area, and how is that being captured in the data, and is it possible to make Namus talk to NCIC? And I don't even know how good NCIC is, or some of those other ones, if they're only voluntary. I know I work with tribal law enforcement. I also work with county law enforcement, and they don't get it right. a lot of times they don't get it right. And even when you're looking at a body, how do you determine what tribe they belong to? Thank you. That concludes my comments for today. I'll be sending in written comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm certainly glad that you raised a number of really good points here. The last one that we can speak to is that Namus and NCIC currently are not allowed to talk to each other. There would need to be a change in federal law for those two systems to collaborate and talk with each other. One of the things that OLJ has looked at is drafting that proposed legislation, and with hopefully potentially moving forward with that, because that seems like an easy fix. And I think that the fact that there are several databases, as you noted, does make things a lot more complicated, just because there are databases that deal with missing persons and databases that deal with murder cases. And so we need to make certain that everybody is entering, if at all possible. Of course, there is not any legislation right now federally that requires entry into NCIC unless the person is under the age of 21. Interestingly enough, though, that federal requirement does not apply to tribal law enforcement. It only applies to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. So there is a gap right there that would need new legislation. So, I mean, obviously, the biggest fix for all of that would be for, you know, every system to be a mandatory entry. But there are, you know, issues with states' rights and those kinds of things as well. So there's, you know, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of issues between figuring out the systems and making sure that the information gets where it needs to be. If a family or a friend is not reporting somebody missing to law enforcement, then they're not going to be an NCIC. And if the family or friend reports the person missing to law enforcement, but law enforcement doesn't report to NCIC, then they're not in the system. I think things have come a significantly long way in terms of law enforcement making reports now that they may not have used to, especially for runaways, as you noted. But I think we still have, you know, some significant work to do. So thank you so much for your comments, muchly appreciated. Daryl, do we have any additional speakers who are on?
Yes, Tracy Cooper is on the line. We'll go ahead and unmute. Tracy, you are unmuted.
Good morning. My name is Tracy Cooper. I'm the general manager for the Native Village of Lynn Creek in Alaska. Just like Desi, we were one of the pilot villages for the MMIP project here. So good morning to my fellow Alaskans and to everybody. Thank you for letting me participate this morning. I was really surprised at the amount of platforms there are for reporting data. I'm not sure how this would work for Alaska due to the logistics, and I know I heard Catherine speak as to having bodies tended to in our communities, you know, due to trying to get law enforcement to the communities and all of the factors we have for facing that. I'm also concerned about the years of the missing and murdered people that is finally coming to light and how these are going to be reported in numerous data systems, along with numerous jurisdictions from what I've seen with our pilot projects, collaborating with all of the agencies, which we're very excited about. I'd like to see families be able to use the Namus. They have the best information on their person. We did have a lot of discussion during CARES and ARPA about tribal membership data being used. A lot of tribes feel that that's more accurate than the census data numbers, and tribes seem to track their own people a lot better than the federal government does. A lot of that is, in my past experience, 25 years with ICWA and the elders, is the mistrust of the federal government. And when we give you this data or when we fill out this survey, how will you use it against us is usually the number one response to filling out a survey or gathering data. So it's very rare that you see someone that's willing to hand over information like that at a personal, the local level, the person that's in the home that we're trying to help. We want to make sure that whenever possible, a tribal affiliation is sought for the victims, irregardless of where the crime is. And as Catherine spoke, we have tribal members that are all over the nation and do settle in different parts all the way up to New York there, but it's still easier for us here in Unalakleet to keep in touch with them because this was their hometown. This is where they call when they need something. So I'm a strong advocate for their tribal data. One issue we've had here in Unalakleet is a senior in-home grant we run through the state of Alaska. And with every grant, you need to collect your data. So the data collection that takes place for this has to go and be entered. And that's where we have a struggle because of our resources, our internet connection, and what needs to be entered in there. It's almost easier to just talk to your grants administrator and say, I have this many, I helped in here and here and here. And they want all these secure servers and stuff, but hopefully our internet structures will change here in Alaska with the tribes getting their FCC licenses and forming their own businesses for internet there. We understand that data is greatly needed to achieve our goals and work with the federal government, usually in the areas of funding. If you don't seem to have that data or statistics, you're not going to get funded for your project. And a lot of these issues have been carrying on for years. So another large pot that you see is the suicide prevention and all the data that's collected there, which is good for you to collect all this information, but we're so busy collecting data and reporting on this data. How do we get these services out to the person when we have one person trying to run this whole program here and make sure that they're counting everything that they do with this and then getting into some of these reporting systems that are highly confusing. Unalakleet has grown with their grants programs here and the services we can offer. And a majority of the time is spent trying to maneuver your grants management systems that all seem to have changed this year. And when you're in a village with a smaller amount of people, your workforce resources, battling the interconnection data can be very daunting task to take care of. So I'd like to say thank you for letting me be here, and we appreciate the time to make the comments. Kuyana.
Marcia, your phone line is muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you so much, Tracy, for those comments. I know when you're in a smaller situation with your tribe and don't have as many resources or don't have as many people to be able to work, especially with the grant requirements, it can cause a significant amount of problems in terms of being able to really access what you'd like to be able to access. I wanted to say congratulations on your tribal community response plan. You guys are doing a really good job there. So thank you so much for being on today and for sharing. So Gerald, do we have any additional speakers?
Yes, Chow Wen Lan are on the line. We'll go ahead and unmute you.
Okay.
Tammy, are you able? There you go. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, I think you're able to hear me right now. My name is Chow Wan Lan. I'm from the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board and the Northwest Tribal Epicenter. We serve the 43 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And because this time we are also holding our quarterly board meeting with the tribal health director, so we have gathered some points here to share for considerations. And we have mainly 5 points related to data. And the first one is how some consideration for how the data is presented. For example, our tribal leaders have expressed concern that in a recent Oregon report released by the U.S. Attorney Office District of Oregon on the MMI report, and it gives specific names of people missing from specific tribes. And the tribal leaders expressed concern because in Oregon tribal communities, when people pass away from the tribes, we usually don't share the picture and the name for a year, and that is a cultural practice for most of the Oregon tribal communities. If the names are used, usually we would say the cultural terms in front of their names, given honor and respect that they have passed on before us or until the family had a releasing ceremony. And a look at the state or federal agency being the tribal leaders would encourage the agency being thoughtful about the cultural practices within the tribal communities so that the individuals and the family can have the respect to the names and their culture, even in the news report or any kind of report given out. And another thing, the tribal leaders have shared consideration. The second point is on the funding based on the data. And because the funding is coming in to fund certain communities, either it's due to the highway or transportation route that has higher impact, and there's a need to increase support for those tribal tribes more affected. But the leaders also wanted to share that because the data may be inaccurate in some ways, then there's an issue of equity of implementing this practices that is the funding based on the data. And because we may not know the full burden, so this might not be the most appropriate way to have disproportional funding. And another point of recommendation or consideration is perhaps regional funding, like funding on the transportation routes. And another point, the third point, is that tribal would like the data pathways that may not be currently in place, is the ability to connect with the social service agency or the state agency, such as the Child Protective Services, foster care, early childhood programs, and other social departments. And that may have been the place where a children or a youth being a youth victim of the sex trafficking, because within the tribes, sometimes it's not talked about. So even the tribe will wish that they have a better communication channel, so then the tribes can have a space to keep track of what's happening and be able to talk back and forth between the tribes and the state agency who actually have the data. And this is not necessary for the data to end up in reports, but also acknowledging that data may be lagging, then what's happening may not show up in the data much later. And the tribe would really wanted to have this communication channel so they can actually have early interventions, and by have faster communication pathways. And a fourth point, another point that's already been mentioned during the presentation, really appreciate that. That is, it's not just of women and girls, but also for men and all relations. And we recognize that the obvious focal point is women and girls, but there are also many missing and murdered men in Indian country. And a fifth point here that we wanted to share and on the data challenges and limitation, and there are two parts to this, and it's also being mentioned earlier. The first part is on the lack of data. That includes how the missing, it's being assessed. And our colleagues at UIHI have put out a report describing the difficulty of accessing missingness. And another point is the lack of the proper data collections and the lack of data access or difficulty of establishing data share agreement with appropriate agency when it's needed. And just recognizing the institutional racism that continue to feel the invisibility of American Indian Alaska Natives data and the scarcity of data that our tribal members have continued to ask information and that could help inform what is the present state on the violence against women that could include the sex or human trafficking data. And the second part on the challenges related to data that we wanted to share that is the issue of the missing race that in a lot of the administrative data, I know that we've heard about the National Violent Death Reporting System and the vital statistic on the death certificates, but we also wanted to bring up that how a lot of time the race is not being entered, and when it's entered, the race may be misclassified. So that's underestimating what the total burden of what's being experienced by the tribal members. And a third point on the data challenges and inaccuracy is on the AI and race information. When it's available, it may not be usable because sometimes it's only coded as AIN alone and not in combination with other race information. So that makes it harder and then not usable for the tribes and tribal leaders. We really appreciate this opportunity to be part of this one, this listening session, and that's the comments and recommendation that we would like to share this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chow, for those comments. From the beginning, Operation Lady Justice has always taken this as a MMIP, missing persons and murder cases involving men and women, boys and girls, all genders, because the problem does persist across all genders. And we need to make certain that we're recognizing that. I think as Russ noted in 2020, of the reports made of missing persons, 55% were female, 45% were male. So there's, they may be different issues in terms of why someone goes missing, but certainly something that we need to be definitely looking at, keeping an eye on. Okay, Daryl, do you have any additional speakers?
Yes, Carmen Harvey's back on. Carmen, if you could hear us, we'll go ahead and unmute your line. I know you addressed us in the Q&A, but you also are registered to provide testimony. Would you like to? Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, with the data collection information that we received this morning, I mean, I really appreciate all of that information, and it's going to help a lot of our MMIP chapters to look into that and to help our clients and our cases, our families to input information into the Namus system, and also just help to better our chapters and looking up all this information that you guys have all shared today. And also with all of us, our chapters in Oklahoma, having our own data systems and looking at other data systems that they're out there that you guys have shared also that we have looked into, kind of collaborating all of that information, which a lot of, we see that there's some names that aren't included in there. And we've also just recently just put the number to the children that have been found in the boarding schools recently. So, and honoring those children that have gone on. So I don't know if you guys all include that into your data as well, but we do include that. And also but also you know, we're hoping to do like another data system with all the information that we do when we get our cases, and we ask different questions, and you know, if you know the missing person has a tattoo, or if they have are on drugs, or if they've ever been trafficked before, have they run away, all those difficult questions. And so that we can keep some data on that as well, because we want to keep track of the revolving door of missing and then our runaways, and we make sure that the runaways are looked for, because they're at risk. They're at risk of being a statistic and being in our systems, and we don't want that. But to keep track of that, and then to do better resourcing and finding those resources to help our families, because they become frustrated. But I really appreciate you all having this this listening session, and to listen to us, and what's going on in our chapters, and when we go out looking for our people. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a MMIP coordinator in Oklahoma to assist us and the families in however way they can. But thank you.
Thanks so much, Connie, for being on and for your comments. And I agree, there are obviously names that are not included in the systems. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to be able to kind of work together, is to have families and tribes and tribal communities make sure that everyone needs to be reported is reported, and they're within the systems where they need to be, so we can make sure that our data that is being collected is accurate. So thank you for being on today. Daryl, how are we doing for speakers? Where are we on our list?
That'll take us to the end of the list, and all those that are available, the rest are not on the line at the moment. So we've come to the end of the speaker list at this time.
Okay. Since we do have a little bit of additional time here, is there anyone who did not register to speak that would like to present testimony before we go to our closing with Task Force member Allison Randall? Is there anybody else who would like to speak while we have Task Force members here? If you do, just go ahead and raise your hand, and Daryl and Tammy can put you through. You can also do a written statement. Just send it to the email operationladyjustice@usdoj.gov. We'll absolutely include that in our transcript, and as part of the listening session, it will be up on the website as well. Have we had anybody who's indicated they wish to speak?
Not at this time.
Okay. What we're going to do at this time then is go ahead and turn it over to Task Force member Allison Randall. Allison is the acting director on the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice, and she is going to do our closing for today.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Allison Randall, the acting director of the Office on Violence Against Women, and it's been incredibly meaningful listening to everyone speak today. I also serve on the Operation Lady Justice Task Force and the Not Invisible Act Commission. I work closely with our office's Deputy Director for Tribal Affairs, Sherry Ann Moore, addressing the needs of American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls is a huge priority for our office that really cuts across all of our work. So I was really honored to be here, and I want to start by thanking everyone who joined the session today, particularly all of the tribal leaders and advocates who made time for this. All of our work in my office, the Office on Violence Against Women, is guided by the principle that we can't end violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women without respect for tribal sovereignty and listening to tribal leaders and communities when we develop and carry out solutions.
And I really want to affirm what others have said today, that a key part of recognizing tribal sovereignty is always ensuring that our actions and efforts take into account that each tribe is unique, and we must not generalize across tribes when we talk about or implement solutions to any challenge in tribal communities, whether that's missing or murdered in women and girls, or violence against women issues, or the overlap between them. And we recognize that Native people may go missing or murdered for many different reasons. This is also a huge issue for men, for boys, for folks who are non-binary. But we also know that for women and girls in particular, there is a lot of overlap with that intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. And our funding can be used to address that intersection, but we also were able to expand our funding for tribal governments, thanks to Savannah's Act, to specifically include addressing law enforcement protocols and better data collection and reporting in missing or murdered cases. So we hope that that funding is useful. We really need better data to solve this problem. We can't solve a problem that we don't understand or can't find people who are missing without enough information. And we can't truly work toward prevention without getting our arms around what is happening and why. For example, really understanding those connections with kids who are running away. So as you've heard today, the federal government agencies have been redoubling efforts to understand data gaps and work to fill them. But we can't do that without you. It's been so valuable to hear from you today. And you've raised a lot of practical, real-world issues that we need to address, including issues of trust and of resources. So, we know there's a lot more to do, and your comments today are a critical part of doing that. So I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to speak, particularly about what I know is an emotionally difficult subject. Particularly as we think about the trauma brought up by the discovery of bodies at boarding schools. And we know that that's been a huge issue here in the US, just as it is in Canada. We understand the historical trauma tied to these issues, and that these conversations really bring that up. And healing for survivors and families and tribal communities has got to be part of everything we do, and acknowledging that historical trauma and historical resilience. We can't move forward without that. So please know that we take your words to heart very deeply. And I thank you for the gift of your time and insight today.
Thank you so much, Allison. We really appreciate your words in sending us off for the day, and in your work on OVW. You've just done some amazing things. Happy to have you on the task force. So as we conclude for today, there are some thank yous that I really want to do for the folks within OLJ, DOI, and HHS who really kind of worked very tirelessly to put all this information together. So we had a number of folks who worked hard to kind of put together the data so that we could explain the different systems and give folks a kind of a primer on this. So thanks so much to Lori McPherson, Russ Myers, and Dreama Fouch, Chuck Urich, and Tina Crossland, and Delight Satter, and Laura Collar, and BJ Spalmer. I mean, you guys have done an amazing job in getting all this information together for the slides that are going to be available on our website for all those of you who wish to have more full access to the information. And I know that Laura especially has been putting a number of things within the chat, a number of the resources, so we hope you're able to take a look at those things. We'd like to thank, again, Chairman Payment, not only for the beautiful opening, but for his very informed and very thoughtful words that we all need to take to heart. Being a lawyer, not a person who is a data person or a statistician, it gives you lots of pause to think about, are we doing things correctly? Are we really measuring what needs to be measured? And then thanks to Liz Fowler for opening us, and to Allison Randall for closing for us. So I think we are at the end of our session today. As noted in the chat, there is an opportunity for written testimony or written comments to be submitted. Even if you've spoken here today, definitely if you feel like you'd like to do that, go right ahead and do. So thank you so much to everybody for both presenting at and for being on, speaking, listening to the data session today. I'm going to take all of this information and really take a look at what we need to be doing better, what legislation needs to be suggested, and making sure that we are honoring both traditions, tribal sovereignty, and those things in the work that we do. So thank you all very much, and I wish you a good rest of the afternoon.